Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of the Oppenheimer live streams. So, today we are going to be going through the 6th transcript of the series, which is the first transcript of the second week of the hearings. So, in total, there are 4 weeks of hearings, which is pretty crazy. Let me show you. So, yeah, 4 weeks of hearings. We can sort of slide past them. And so we're now on the second week. So this is April 19th, 1954. And yeah, so this week, I think it's just going to be more testimony. Today's actually got a lot of different witnesses. The witnesses are going to be Gordon Dean, Hans Bethe, James B. Fisk, and Frederick Osborne. So the only name of those that I'm familiar with is Hans Bethe because he was a pretty well-known physicist and a contemporary of Oppenheimer, and he worked on the Manhattan Project, and he was depicted in the Christopher Nolan movie. So he is a pretty significant figure in this whole story. But the others are also, former associates of Oppenheimer, and we'll learn more about them. We'll learn more about them as the hearing gets on. So, yeah. And as always, I will recommend that if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the live chat and I will answer them, or in the comment section below after the live stream is done and you're watching the VOD, I will answer those as promptly as I can. So, yeah, it looks like everything's in order. Actually, let me just check on the audio as always, just to make sure it sounds good. All right, sounds good. So, without further ado, let's get started on this episode's hearing. Okay. The above entitled matter came on for hearing pursuant to recess before the board at 9:30 a.m. Mr. Gray, we will start the proceedings. I should like the record to reflect that Mr. Morgan, who, as you all recall, found it necessary to leave the proceedings before we completed our work on Friday, has read carefully the transcript made of the proceedings, especially that portion which took place in his absence, and is thoroughly familiar with what transpired. Is that correct? That is correct. That is also, I think, one of the first few things he said. This guy does not talk a lot. He's just kind of there. Anyway. I think the record ought to show that. Now, Mr. Robb. Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rothman is here and will play these records for us. Counsel for Dr. Oppenheimer have been furnished with 2 copies of the transcript to follow. I would suggest that in the event that anyone at any time wishes any portion of the recording played again so that we may check it, if you will just so indicate, we will do that. Of course, that includes the reporter. I understand it is most difficult for a reporter to take this down on a machine. So if the reporter wishes to stop and having something played over again, that will be done. Of course, Mr. Garrison, anything that he wishes to be played over, if he will, just indicate it will be done. Suppose we find, Mr. Chairman, as we listen to this, that what seems to us to be variances between sound and text. Should we make a note of those as we go along? I think that would be the proper procedure. I think that would be the only way to do it, Mr. Garrison. Mr. Rothman, would you begin to play the records? I might say, gentlemen, for your benefit, to assist you, at the beginning of this record you will hear some door slamming and seat creaking and so on, and some introductory gabble, which is not important here. I suppose people are coming into the room and sitting down. The transcript, which begins, "This is a pleasure," does not begin for perhaps 30 seconds. Mr. Chairman, could we have read into the record the first paragraph of the transcript that will not appear in the sound? Do you wish me to do that, Mr. Chairman? If you would. Quote, San Francisco, California, August 27, 1943. Memorandum for the officer in charge. Subject, DSM project. Retranscription of conversation between Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, Lieutenant Colonel Boris Pash, and Lieutenant Lyle Johnson. Transmitted herewith is the transcript of conversation between Dr. J. R. Oppenheimer, Lieutenant Colonel Boris T. Pash, and Lieutenant Lyle Johnson, held in Lieutenant Johnson's office in the new classroom building, University of California, Berkeley, California, on August 26, 1943. It is to be noted that in some places the conversation was very indistinct and that the running commentary may be indecisive in these places, but the substance of the material discussed is herewith presented. Pash. This is a pleasure because I am interested to a certain extent in activities and I feel I have a certain responsibility in a child which I don't know anything about. General Grove has, more or less, I feel, placed a certain responsibility in me, and it's like having a child that you can't see by remote control. I don't mean to take much of your time. Oppenheimer. That's perfectly all right. Whatever time you choose. Pash. Mr. Johnson told me about the little incident or conversation taking place yesterday in which I am very much interested, and it had me worried all day yesterday since he called me up. I thought if he could, Oppenheimer, I was rather uncertain as to whether I should or should not talk to him. I am unwilling to do it without authorization. What I wanted to tell this fellow was that he had been indiscreet. I know that he had revealed information. I know that saying that much might in some cases embarrass him. It doesn't seem to have been capable of embarrassing him, to put it bluntly. Pash. That is not the particular interest I have. It is something a little more, in my opinion, more serious. Mr. Johnson said that there was a possibility that there may be some other groups interested. Oppenheimer. I think that is true, but I have no first-hand knowledge, and that would not be for that reason very useful to me. I think it is true that a man whose name I never heard, who was attached to the Soviet consul, has indicated indirectly through intermediary people concerned in this project that he was in a position to transmit without any danger of leak or anything of that kind, or a scandal, information which they might supply. That is one correction that you passed over, that intermediary and not intermediaries. And that is true instead of that. Then there's discussion off the record. The only comment I would make, Mr. Chairman, is that in quite a number of places, I think I marked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there were scraps of talk that were not recorded because of the speed. Also, here a word and there a word was either dropped out in the speed of the transcription, or the order was sometimes inverted a little bit. I'm not saying that this alters the substance, but I do think that if there comes a passage. That is true, Mr. Chairman. I think this suggestion is a very excellent one. I'm sure if there is any matter of substance which counsel finds of recording which he feels is different from the transcript, I trust he will indicate that we may play the record again and also that we will agree on it. Will you do that, Mr. Garrison? I want to make it clear that we are not attempting, and we can't, on one playing, to authenticate the entire record. Very good. Shall we go ahead, Mr. Garrison? Mr. Rothman resumed playing back the recording. Oppenheimer. Since I know it to be a fact, and then there seem to be some words in the conversation which do not appear in the transcript immediately prior to the sentence reading, since I know it to be a fact. This conversation apparently dealing in some way with the Soviet consulate. Then, back to the recording. since I know it to be a fact, I have been particularly concerned. I think what was said there is that Dr. Oppenheimer is saying it might be assumed that a man attached to the Soviet consul might be doing this, but since I know it to be a fact, I have been particularly concerned. That is my interpretation. It is something like that, Mr. Chairman. I was not exactly clear. We might have it once more if you don't mind. Then back to the recording. I will take it assumed that a man attached to the Soviet consul might be doing this, but since I know it to be a fact, I have been particularly concerned about any indiscretions which took place in circles close which might be in contact with it. To put it quite frankly, I would feel friendly to the idea of the commander-in-chief informing the Russians who are working on this problem. Then we have... May we stop at this point? Mr. Chairman, I think it quite clear from the recording that the sentence read, quote, I would feel friendly to the idea of the commander-in-chief informing the Russians that we are working on this problem. I would have to ask that it be played again. And back to the recording. I will take it to be so assumed that a man attached to the Soviet consul might be doing this, but since I know it to be a fact, I have been particularly concerned about any indiscretions which took place in circles close to the consul or which might come in contact with it. To put it quite frankly, I would feel friendly to the idea of the commander-in-chief informing the Russians that we were working on this problem. At least I can see that there might be some arguments for doing that, but I do not feel friendly to the idea of having that. I think that it might not hurt to be on the lookout for it. May we stop at that point? Is the chairman satisfied that the phrase was, quote, informing the Russians that we were working on the problem? That is the way I heard it. It is not clear to me, but I think it is clear that the word simply was not who. Precisely what the word or words might have been, I'm not sure, but my inclination is to feel that it is as you suggest. Counsel would agree? That was my understanding of it, Mr. Garrison. That it did read, quote, informing the Russians that we were working on it. I think it is. Either one, it doesn't matter, Mr. Chairman. I would point out that in the cross-examination of Dr. Oppenheimer, this particular phrase was picked out. Let's see. One second. Okay. Okay, sorry about that. All right, resuming. I'll go back to the top of that statement right there from Mr. Garrison. Either one, it doesn't matter, Mr. Chairman. I would point out that in the cross-examination of Dr. Oppenheimer, this particular phrase was picked out of the transcripts about informing the Russians, as it reads here, quote, who are working on this problem, as if there were something sinister about it. It came as a great surprise to Dr. Oppenheimer, and I think the record now should explicitly show that this was an error in transcription, and that any notion that the Russians were then working on this problem was simply not suggested in this conversation. I wouldn't go so far as that, sir. I think the record shows that the recording says, I think that is as far as we can go. I think there is agreement between counsel as to what seems to be the correct transcript now on this point. Certainly, speaking for the board, I don't think we can draw any conclusions into the record at this point, Mr. Garrison. I think the record ought to be clear as to what the language was. I want to make clear that any inference drawn from the previous cross-examination is now to be wiped out. I should think that you would wish, on redirect, if I can use that term, to come back to this point. Certainly the record now will reflect what the consensus is as to this language. I'm just hesitant to accept an interpretation of counsel as a part of a board conclusion at this time. What we are doing is correcting the record as I understand it. You are certainly free to come back to this. Will you start at the beginning? Then back to the recording. Oppenheimer. I probably know this. I will take it is to be assumed that a man attached to the Soviet consul might be doing this, but since I know it to be a fact, I have been particularly concerned. End quote. Back to Mr. Robb. Mr. Chairman, might I interpose at this point? I think it is pretty clear now, Mr. Garrison, that the beginning of that sentence is I would take it that it would be assumed that a man attached to the Soviet consulate might be doing this, but since I know it to be a fact, end quote. Isn't that the way you heard it? That is about the way I heard it. Did you hear it any differently than that? I think that is about correct. While we are on this interruption, my interpretation of the recording is that the words AIDS should have been circles. Yes, Mr. Chairman. I had already corrected that in my transcript. Would you proceed, Mr. Rathman? Then back to the recording. I would take it that it is to be assumed that a man attached to the Soviet consulate might be doing it, but since I know it to be a fact, I have been particularly concerned about any indiscretion which took place in circles close enough to come in contact with it. To put it quite frankly, I would feel friendly to the idea of the commander-in-chief informing the Russians that we were working on this problem. At least I can see that there might be some arguments for doing that, but I do not feel friendly to the idea of having it moved out the back door. I think that it might not hurt to be on the lookout for it. Pash, could you give me a little more specific information as to exactly what information you have? I mean, you can readily realize that phrase would be, to me, probably of interest as pretty near the whole project is to you. Oppenheimer. Well, I might say that the approaches were always through other people who were troubled by them, and sometimes came and discussed them with me, and that the approaches were always quite indirect, so that I would feel that to give more perhaps than one name would be to implicate people whose attitude was one of bewilderment rather than one of cooperation. I know of no case, and I am fairly sure that in all cases where I heard of it, these contacts would not have yielded a single thing. That is as far as I can go on that. Now, there is a man whose name was mentioned here a couple of times. I do not know of my own knowledge. He is involved as an intermediary. It seems, however, not impossible, and if you wanted to watch him, it might be the appropriate thing to do. He spent a number of years in the Soviet Union. I think he is a chemical engineer. He may not be here. He was, at the time I was with him here, employed at the shell development. His name is Eltonton. I would think that there was a small chance that, well, let me put it this way. I think he has probably been asked to do what he can to provide information. Whether he is successful or not, I don't know. But if he talked to a friend of his who was also an acquaintance of one of the men on the approach, that was one of the channels by which this thing went on. Now, I think that, and then an interruption. Okay, back to the recording. Asked to do what he could to provide information. Whether he was successful or not, I couldn't know. But he talked to a friend of his who was also an acquaintance of one of the men on the project, and that was one of the channels by which this thing went. Now, I think that to go beyond that would be to put a lot of names down of people who are not only innocent, but whose attitude is 100% effective. Let's see. Yeah. Sometimes there's typos. They said those instead of whose. Not sure. Anyway, now Pash says, now here's a point. You can readily realize that if we get information like that, we have to work in an absolutely discreet manner. In other words, we can't afford to indicate, Oppenheimer, that you are concerned. Pash, that we are concerned or through whom we get information. Oppenheimer, naturally. Pash, however, any end of recording. Now, Mr. Gray, I should like to record my observation about some of these words here. Yes, sir. First of all, it is pretty clear to me, going back to this earlier paragraph, that the language should be, quote, informing the Russians that we were working on this project, end quote. That is correct. Then in the third paragraph, I believe in the first sentence, it should read, quote, well, I might say that the approaches were always to other people, end quote, rather than through other people. I would like to have that played back. Will you play the beginning of this again, please? Mr. Chairman, so that we do this in the same order, I listened to those words that were in the middle of the sentence, beginning, at least, quote, at least I can see that there might be some arguments for doing, end quote. I then heard these words, quote, I don't know whether it could or could not be done, but I don't like the idea of having them moved out the back door, end quote. I don't know. There are some words in there that I didn't get. Let us see, and we will play it again. I hope these records don't get worn out while we are playing them. I hope we don't have to play the whole thing through just for this one thing. No, that is right at the beginning. Recording. It must be assumed that a man attached to the Soviet consulate might be doing this, but since I know it to be fact, I have been particularly concerned about any indiscretions which took place in circles close to the consul or which might come in contact with it, because, to put it quite frankly, I would feel friendly to the idea of the commander-in-chief informing the Russians that we were working on this problem. At least I can see that there might be some argument for doing that. I don't know whether it could or not have been done, but I don't like the idea of having it moved out the back door. I think that it might not hurt to be on the lookout for it. Pash, could you give me a little more specific information as to exactly what information you have? I mean, you can readily realize that phase would be, to me, probably as interesting as pretty near the whole project is to you. Oppenheimer, well, I might say that the approaches were always to other people, who were troubled by them, and sometimes came and discussed them with me. End of recording. Mr. Chairman, it is quite plain that the sentence reads, quote, I might say that the approaches were always to other people, end quote. Is that correct, Mr. Garrison? Yes. Then a few minor ones. May I say, with Mr. Garrison's help, I do find the phrase, quote, I don't know whether it could or could not be done, but, end quote, comes in. Quote, I am not friendly to the idea of having it move out the back door. That is right. Further, in that third paragraph, I think that the third sentence would read, or portions of it, quote, and that the approaches were always quite indirect, end quote. The word always. Yes, Mr. Chairman. In the fifth line, very minor, the word, quote, attitudes should be attitude singular. Yes. Down about the middle of that paragraph, quote, he spent quite a number of years in the Soviet Union. I also heard the words, quote, he is an Englishman in there. That is in here, isn't it? No, quote, he spent, end quote. I have interlineated he is an Englishman or he is English. I think that is in there someplace, but that is not very important. No. There are a couple of other places. The word is should have been was, and the project should be this project. The sentence reading, quote, I think there is a small chance, end quote. I think the is there that the word was. That is after the word Eltiton. Quote, his name is Eltiton. I would think there was a small chance. That is correct. Mr. Chairman, may I ask Mr. Garrison, is there any question that the voice we hear in the paragraphs marked O is Dr. Oppenheimer? Not so far. Are we ready to proceed? While he is fixing that record, a very minor one, I think Colonel Pash said, quote, absolute discrete manner, rather than absolutely. I'm not bothered with that type of correction, Mr. Chairman. Back to the recording that we might get, which would eliminate a lot of research work on our part, would necessarily lead to the conclusion anything we are doing. Oppenheimer, I'm giving you the one name I think. I mean, I don't know the man attached to the consulate, but I think I may have been told, or I may not have been told. But I have actually forgotten. He is, and he may not be here now. These incidents occurred in the order of about 5, 6, or 7 months. Johnson, I was wondering, Dr. Oppenheimer, if there was a particular person, maybe a person on the project that you were trying to pull information from, that if we knew who those were, would at least know where to look for a lead, not from the standpoint of fellow hate, but looking at a certain picture. Pash. Here is the point that I would feel, Oppenheimer. I would feel that the people that tried to get information from were more or less an accident, and I would be making some harm by saying that. Pash. Yes, here's the thing. We of course assume that the people who bring this information to you are 100% with you, and therefore there is no question about their intentions. However, if Oppenheimer, well, I will tell you one thing. End of recording. Was that word, quote, lead or, quote, leak? I thought it was leak. It is lead here. Yes, it sounded like leak to me. It sounded like leak to me. Quote, I was wondering, Dr. Oppenheimer, if there is a particular person, maybe a person on the project, that you were trying to pump information from, that if we knew who those were, would at least know where to look for a leak. Play that again, please. Recording. These events occurred on the order of 5, 6, or 7 months ago. Johnson. I was wondering, Dr. Oppenheimer, if there is a particular person, maybe a person on the project that you were trying to pump information from, that if we knew who those were, would at least know where to look for a leak, not from the standpoint of fellow hate, but looking at a certain picture. Pash. Here's the point that I would feel, Oppenheimer. I would feel that the people that if they tried to get information were more or less an accident, and I believe I would be making some harm by saying that. Pash. Yes, here's the thing. We of course assume that the people who bring this information to you are 100% with you, and therefore there is no question about their intentions. However, if Oppenheimer, well, I will tell you one thing. I have known 2 or 3 cases, and I think 2 of them are the men with me at Los Alamos. They are men who are very closely associated with me. Pash. Have they told you that either they thought they were contacted for that purpose or they actually were contacted for that purpose? Oppenheimer. They told me that they were contacted. Pash. For that purpose. Oppenheimer. That is, let me give you the background. The background was, well, you know how difficult it is with the relations between these 2 allies. And there are a lot of people who don't feel very friendly toward Russia, so that the information, a lot of our secret information, our radar and so on, doesn't get to them. And they are battling for their lives, and they would like to have an idea of what's going on. This is just to make up, in other words, for the defects of our official communication. That is the form in which it was. Now, I will say here, just interject, that that's an interesting kind of moral dilemma brought up in the transcript there, because at this time, this recording is during World War II, obviously, during the Manhattan Project, and, you know, the U.S. and Britain were wary of Russia, the Soviet Union, but at the same time, they sort of had to work together to fight against Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy and Imperial Japan, because it's sort of an enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of tense alliance, where as soon as the war is over, as we saw, the alliance disintegrated and became a bitter rivalry. So it is an interesting moral dilemma to say, should you supply your temporary allies with technological developments that might save, their lives on the Eastern Front and make them a more effective army, but it could come back to bite you in the future. So that is very interesting. I could see people going either way on that. I mean, we've seen that in more modern times too. People talk about like how uh, there are like modern terrorist groups that were funded back in the 70s by the US to like resist Soviet invasions of various countries. So it's interesting when you get into alliances that are weak and sort of alliances of convenience. A question of how much do you really want to share with your quote unquote allies? Because it could come back to harm you in the future. And yeah, so that is very interesting. Um, in the Oppenheimer movie, they showed how the Manhattan Project collaborated with Britain. And that makes sense because Britain, uh, you know, it's been a long time since the Revolutionary War. So the US and Britain have a very close alliance. I think it's often called a special relationship. So, there's no question, there's no real worry of Britain turning on us in the near future, right? It's not an ally of convenience, it's a strong alliance. So it makes sense that the US was more willing to share information with Britain than the USSR. Um, but again, it's just one of these sort of difficult questions where it's like, how much is present necessity going to be weighed against future risk? But anyway, I'll get back to reading this recording that they're analyzing here. Pash. Oh, I see. Oppenheimer. Of course, the actual fact is that it is not a communication that ought to be taking place, but it is a matter of carrying out a policy which was more or less a policy of the government, and the form in which it came as that. Could an interview be arranged with this man Elton, who had very good contact with a man from the embassy attached to the consulate who was a very reliable guy? That is his story, and who had a lot of experience in microfilm work. Pash. Well now, I may be getting back to a systematic picture here, but do you mind, these people whom you mentioned, two are down with you now. Were they contacted by Elton direct? Oppenheimer. No. Pash. Through another party? Oppenheimer. Yes. Pash. Well, now, could we know through whom that contact was made? Oppenheimer. I think it would be a mistake. End of recording. Mr. Chairman, could we stop? I have several corrections, Mr. Chairman. Very well. In the first paragraph on that page, Mr. Garrison, we pretty well agreed on, and the second. Except I would just like to note the phrase, quote, not from the standpoint of fellow hate, end quote, that there were quite indistinguishable words that accompanied that. I don't know what those words were. I would question myself that the words were, quote, fellow hate. I don't know. There were other words not in there. I might say that the J indicated there is Lieutenant Johnson, who was also present. In the third line on that page of the transcript, as I heard it, it is, quote, these instances occurred of the order of about 5, 6, or 7 months ago, end quote. Is that correct? That is right. As I heard it in the paragraph marked H, the word lead should be leak. The words fellow hate, I don't pick that up. The next paragraph marked O, as I heard it, read, quote, I would feel that the people that they tried to get information from, end quote. Did you get that, Mr. Garrison? Yes. I think that was clear. The next paragraph marked O. While we were on that paragraph, after the words accident, there were some words interpolated by Mr. Pash that did not come through on the transcript. Yes, that is correct. The next paragraph marked O, as I got it, reads, quote, "Well, I will tell you one thing. I have known of 2 or 3 cases, and I think 2 of the men were with me at Los Alamos," end quote. Did you get that? Yes. Quote, "They are men who are very closely associated with me." Correct. Then the next large paragraph marked O reads as I got it in the third and fourth lines, quote, "There are a lot of people that don't feel very friendly to Russia," end quote, instead of toward the Russians. Did you get that? I did. It is, quote, "a lot of people who don't feel very friendly," end quote. Yes, sir. That is right. In the last paragraph on that page, as I got it, it reads, quote, "Of course, the actual fact is that since it is not a communication which ought to be taking place, it is treasonable, but it was not presented in that method," end quote. Right after that word, method, I had some words. That didn't come through. Yes, sir. Quote, "It is a method of carrying out a policy which was more or less a policy of the government, and the form in which it came was that an interview be arranged with this man Elton, who had very good contacts with a man from the embassy attached to the consulate, who was a very reliable guy and who had a lot of experience in microfilm work or whatever," end quote. That or whatever, I would like to have it played again. I think there was another word or two after the word whatever. I think so, but I didn't get it. Quote, "in microfilm work," end quote, and also after the word given, there were 2 or 3 words that I didn't get. Back to the recording. A policy which has more or less a policy of the government, a policy which was more or less a policy of the government, and the form in which it came was that could an interview be arranged with this man Elton, who had very good contacts with a man from the embassy attached to the consulate, who was a very reliable guy. That is his story, and who had a lot of experience in microfilm work or whatever. Pash, I may be getting back to a little systematic picture. End of recording. Will you stop there? Mr. Garrison, I don't know whether you got it the way I did, but I thought I heard who was a very reliable guy, a kind of parenthetical story. That is his story. Yes. After whatever, it said the hell. Thank you. Quote, "a lot of experience in microfilm work or whatever the hell." Dr. Oppenheimer is certainly the best expert on his own voice. In the next paragraph, when he plays that, I think the word "to" right in the middle on the top of page 4, "to" are down there, should be "who." Will you play that again? Then back to the recording. Pash. Oh, wait, sorry. I don't know what to put up for recording, so I'm just leaving it on the person who spoke last. But yeah. Okay, Pash. Well, now, I may be getting back to a little systematic picture, but do you mind, these people whom you mentioned, who were down there with you now, were they contacted by Elton? Oppenheimer, no. Pash, through another party? Oppenheimer, yes. Pash, well, now, could we know through whom that contact was made? Oppenheimer, I think it would be a mistake. End of recording. I still got a 2. I thought it was who. I thought it was who. Back to the recording. Pash, these people whom you mentioned, who were down with you now, were they contacted by Elton direct? Oppenheimer, no. Pash, through another party? Oppenheimer, yes. Pash, well, now, could we know through whom that contact was made? Oppenheimer, I think it would be a mistake. End of recording. I don't know. I would like to know how many of us thought it was who and how many of us thought it was to. I thought personally it was who. Let us make this the last time. Recording. I may be getting back to a little systematic picture here, but do you mind these people who you mentioned? Two are down there with you now. Were they contacted by Eltiton direct? Oppenheimer. No. Pash. Through another party? Oppenheimer. Yes. Pash. Well now, could we know through whom that contact was made? I think it would be a mistake. End of recording. Mr. Morgan thinks it is two, and I could flip a coin. I don't know that it is terribly important. I don't know, Mr. Chairman. Why don't we put who and to in the transcript? Is that all right, Mr. Garrison? It is all right with me. I would note also there are some words after systematic picture indicated by the dots that don't appear. That is something like, quote, getting back to a little systematic picture if you don't mind, end quote. Something like that. I would observe that those are the first dots we have seen in this transcript, although we have all agreed that there are some words and passages that don't appear in quite a number of places. All right, recording. I think I have told you where the initiative came from, and that the other things are almost purely accidental, and it would involve people who ought not to be involved in this. Pash. Yes, well, this would not involve the people, but it indicates to us Eltiton's channel. We would have to know that this is definite on Eltiton, and we, of course, naturally, Oppenheimer. It is not definite in the sense that I have seen him do the thing. Pash. No. Oppenheimer. He may have been misquoted. Pash. That's right. Oppenheimer. I don't believe so. Now, Eltiton is a member of the FAECT, whether or not Pash, that is the union. Oppenheimer, that is the CIO. He is a man whose sympathies are certainly very far left, whatever his affiliations, and he may or may not have regular contacts with a political group. I doubt it. In any case, it is a safe thing to say that the channels that would be followed in this case are those involving people who have generally been sympathetic to the Soviet and somehow connected peripherally with the communist movement in this country. That's obvious. I don't need to tell you that. Pash. Yes, the fact is, this second contact, the contact that Eltiton had to make with these other people, is that person also a member of the project? Oppenheimer. No. Pash. That also is an outsider. Oppenheimer. It's a member of the faculty, but not of the project. Pash. A member of the faculty here? Eltiton made it through a member of the faculty to the project. Oppenheimer. As far as I know, these approaches were... ... There may have been more than one person involved. I don't know. Pash. Here's how I feel about this leftist inclination. I think that whether a man has left or right inclinations, it is his character which is back of it. If he is willing to do this, it doesn't make any difference what his inclinations are. It is based on his character, primarily, and not Oppenheimer. Yes, a thing like this going on, let us say, with the Nazis, would have a somewhat different color. I don't mean to say it would be any more deserving of attention or any more dangerous, but it would involve probably different motives. Pash. Yes. Oppenheimer. I'm pretty sure that none of the guys here, with the possible exception of the Russian, who is doing probably his duty by his country, but the other guys that were just, they didn't do anything. But they were considering the step which they would have regarded as thoroughly in line with the policy of this government, and just making up for the fact that there were a couple of guys in the State Department who would block such communications. You may or may not know that in many projects we share information with the British, and some we do not. And there was a great deal of feeling about that, and I don't think that the issues involved here seem to people very different, except that, of course, the people on the project realize the importance, and the whole procedure gets away from them. Pash. Now, do you feel... End of recording. Now back to Mr. Robb. I noticed a few minor corrections, but none I think that is worth talking about unless Mr. Garrison has some. I have one that may be minor, but perhaps it should be noted. In the paragraph that the CIO union, in the fourth line, I believe that the language was, quote, a safe thing to say that the channels that would be followed in this case, end quote, instead of to be followed. Did you get that? I didn't get that. Did Mr. Garrison get that? No, Mr. Marks said he did. We accept that. Could I, in the same paragraph, note that after the words, quote, I doubt it, by Mr. Oppenheimer, I heard an interjection by Mr. Pash saying, here is the way I feel about this case, and then it carries on with Mr. Oppenheimer saying, quote, it is a safe thing to say. I think that is true. I mention that because here is the word case, which is put in Dr. Oppenheimer's mouth, which in fact came from Mr. Pash. I don't think it alters the substance. I think Dr. Oppenheimer did use the word case. It appeared that Colonel Pash interrupting Dr. Oppenheimer and Dr. Oppenheimer keeping on talking, I heard Dr. Oppenheimer's voice saying, in any case, although I don't know that is important. You heard the word case twice. Yes. You heard the word case again. I thought I did, yes. Do you want to play it over again? Recording. He may have been misquoted. Pash. That's right. Oppenheimer. I don't believe so. Now, Eltiton is a member of the FAECT, whether or not Pash. That is the union. Oppenheimer. That is the CIO union. He is a man whose sympathies are certainly very far left, whatever his affiliation is, and he may or may not have regular contacts with a political group. I doubt it. Pash. Here is the way I feel. Oppenheimer. In any case, it is a safe thing to say that the channels that will be followed in this case are those involving people who have generally been sympathetic to the Soviet. End of recording. Mr. Robb. I don't know who said it, Mr. Garrison. It is my impression that there was an interruption by Colonel Pash, and Dr. Oppenheimer did say, in any case, it is a safe thing. I don't know that it is important. I don't think it's important. I don't think there are two things I should point... Oh, sorry. I do think there are two things I should point up in the fifth paragraph, about the middle of that paragraph, where I believe Dr. Oppenheimer said, quote, might block such communications, end quote, rather than would. Yes, I heard that too. Yes, Mr. Chairman. In the last line of that paragraph, I don't think the words, quote, gets away from them, end quote, are correct. The word gets is not correctly transcribed, but I can't tell what it was. That whole last line to me is rather indistinct. There were some words that don't appear, and I don't quite get the sense of it. I don't either, Mr. Garrison, but I don't think it is terribly important. Mr. Chairman, I would just make this suggestion, perhaps in view of the time pressure under which we are all laboring. Possibly the chairman, in order to save the time of the board, would think it appropriate that we might make an arrangement with counsel on the other side to continue this playing at some time that would not take up the time of the board, and bring to the board and read into the record any changes that we agree upon. I think we probably would have no difficulty in doing that. I don't press that. That might be possible, unless the board wishes to participate in this. I'm sorry to engage in a time-consuming procedure, Mr. Garrison, but I'm inclined to think that if there are to be any changes in the record, the board, regrettably, must hear them. I'm sorry about the delay involved. Back to the recording. Pash. Do you feel that would affect, and there could be continued attempts now to establish this type of contact? Oppenheimer. I haven't any idea. Pash. You haven't any idea. Oppenheimer. As I say, if the guy that was here may by now be in some other town, and all that I would have in mind is this. I understood that this man, to whom I feel a sense of responsibility, Lamanitz, and I feel it for two reasons. One, he is doing work which he started and which he ought to continue. And second, since I more or less made a stir about it when the question came up, that this man may have been indiscreet in circles which would lead to trouble. That is the only thing that I have to say. I don't have any doubt that people often approached him with whom he has contacted. I mean, whom he sees might feel it either their duty, if they got word of something, to let it go further, and that is the reason why I feel quite strongly that association with the communist movement is not compatible with the job on a secret war project. It is just that the two loyalties cannot go. Pash. Yes, well, Oppenheimer. That is not an expression of political opinion. I think that a lot of very brilliant and thoughtful people have been something in the communist movement, and that they may belong there. Maybe it is a good thing for the country. They hope that it doesn't belong on the war project. Pash. I get your point. I don't want to seem to you insistent. I want to again, I think, explore the possibility of getting the name of the person on the faculty. I will tell you for what reason. Not for the purpose of taking him to task in any way, whether it is unofficially, officially, or openly, or what, but to try to see Eltiton's method of approach. You may not agree with me, but I can assure you that that is one of the more important steps. Oppenheimer. I have to take the following points of view. I think in mentioning Eltiton's name, I subsequently said about the man that I think that he may be acting in a way which is dangerous to this country, and which should be watched. I am not going to mention the name of anyone in the same breath, even if you say that you will make a distinction. I just can't do that, because in the other cases, I'm convinced from the way in which they handled the thing that they themselves thought it was a bad business. Pash. These other people, yes, I realize, but here's the point, Doctor. If that man is trying to make other contacts for Eltiton, Oppenheimer, yes. Pash, you see, it would take us some time to try to. Oppenheimer, my honest opinion is that he probably isn't. That he ran into them at a party and they saw each other or something, and Eltiton said, quote, "Do you suppose you could help me? This is a very serious thing because we know that important work is going on here and we think this ought to be available to our allies, and would you see if any of those guys are willing to help us with it, and then it wouldn't have to be so much." And then some inaudible conversation and the recording is again paused. There was one place there, quote, "not for the purpose of taking him to task in any way, whether it be unofficially, officially, or openly," end quote. Yes. I think one of the more important steps, Colonel Pash said, one of the most important steps. Did you get that? I didn't have it. Yes. There was an overriding remark of Dr. Oppenheimer in which he said, quote, "I understand that," end quote. Did you gentlemen catch that? Yes. Yes. The word subsequently, I understand. Sorry, the word subsequently I understood as essentially. Yes, subsequently should read essentially in the next paragraph. I think in mentioning Eltiton's name, I essentially said, sorry, quote, "I think in mentioning Eltiton's name, I essentially said about the man," end quote. I didn't get that. In the paragraph at the top where he said that is not an expression of political opinion, I think a lot of very brilliant and thoughtful people have been something in the communist movement, and that they maybe belong there, and that maybe it is a good thing for the country. I think so. I thought I heard instead of, quote, "they hope it doesn't belong," end quote, quote, "I hope it doesn't belong on the war project," end quote. Did you get that? I didn't. It was very indistinct. I think it was I heard some words after War Project that I couldn't get. Also, some of the words in the next Pash paragraph at the end after one of the more important steps. Most important steps. Most. Dr. Oppenheimer said, I understand, after that. Yes, then instead of, quote, I have to take, end quote, it is, quote, I wish. Did you get that? I understand that, but I have to take the following point. That is already your correction. Yes. Are there any other suggestions about that portion? I have no more. Will you proceed, Mr. Rathman? Back to the recording. Pash, were these two people you mentioned, were they contacted at the same time? Oppenheimer, they were contacted within a week of each other. Pash, they were contacted at two different times. Oppenheimer, yes, but not in each other's presence. I just want to pause for a moment, check if there's any chat. Okay. Again, feel free to leave any questions in the chat. Okay. Oppenheimer, yes, but not in each other's presence. Pash, that's right. And then from what you first heard, there is someone else who probably still remains here who was contacted as well. Oppenheimer, I think that's true. Pash, what I'm driving at is that there was a plan, at least for some length of time, to make these contacts, and we may not have known all the contacts. Oppenheimer, that is certainly true. That is why I mentioned it. If I knew all about it, then I would say forget it. I thought it would be appropriate to call to your attention the fact that these channels at one time existed. Pash, yes. Oppenheimer, I really think that I am drawing a line in the right place. Pash, you see, you understand that I am sort of. You picture me as a bloodhound on the trail, and that I'm trying to get out of you everything I possibly can. Oppenheimer, that is your duty to a certain extent. Pash, you see what I mean. Oppenheimer, it is also my duty not to implicate these people, acquaintances or colleagues, of whose position I am absolutely certain. Myself and my duty is to protect them. Pash, oh yes. Oppenheimer, if I thought that, I won't say it, it might be slightly off. Pash, well then, here's another point, Doctor. If we find that in making these various contacts that we get some information which would lead us to believe that certain of these men may have either considered it or still are considering it, mind you, I do not even know these men, so it can't be personal. Oppenheimer, no. Well, none of them that I had anything to do with even considered it. They were just upset about it. They have a feeling toward this country and have signed the Espionage Act. They feel this way about it, for I think that the intermediary between Elton and the project thought it was the wrong idea, but said that this was the situation. I don't think he supported it. In fact, I know it. I know it. Pash. He made about at least 3 contacts that we know of. Oppenheimer. Well, I think that's right, yes. Pash. And 2 of those contacts were down there. That means we can assume at least that there is one of these men contacted still on the project here. Oppenheimer. Yes, I believe that this man has gone or is scheduled to go to Site X. Pash. This third man? Oppenheimer. I think so. Pash. Well, why can't you cross that line? I certainly appreciate this much. Oppenheimer. I think it's a thing you ought to know. Pash. Oh, no doubt. Oppenheimer. I think it's probably one of those sporadic things, and I do not think, I have no way of thinking it was systematic, but I got from the way it was handled, which was rather loosely, and frankly, if I were an agent, I would not put much confidence in people who are loose-mouthed or casual. End of recording. Are there any observations about that portion of the transcript? The word Oppenheimer was after doctor. The sixth paragraph, quote, Dr. Oppenheimer, I really think I am drawing a line in the right place, end quote. That phrase, quote, a line in the right place, end quote. I didn't get it. Something about a line. Something about it. If he plays it over enough, it will come out in the right place, but I don't know. I've not played it over enough. Do you want to play it again? I don't think so, unless we find something more difficult. I just want to say I didn't even get it. I think in the paragraph below that, where it says, quote, it is also my duty not to implicate these people, acquaintances, or colleagues, end quote, and so on, I think the end so on is correct. That is correct, and after the people, quote, and who are. I think so. There are some indistinct words in Mr. Pash's previous two sentences at the end. Then coming down, quote, Dr. Oppenheimer, if I thought that, I won't say it. It might be slightly off, and some indistinct words, end quote. That's right. Then the next paragraph, quote, they were upset about it, end quote. That's right. Then some indistinct words followed that. I think so. On that paragraph, all the rest of it seemed to me just fuzzy. The word even, I think, was not in that paragraph in the first line. While none of them that I had anything to do with considered it, they were just upset about it, is the way I heard it. Yes. Do you want that paragraph played again? I'm not sure it would do any good. Let us try it. Recording. Pash. Certain of these men may have considered it or are still considering it. Mind you, I don't even know these men, so it can't be personal. Oppenheimer. None of these that I had anything to do with even considered it. Pash. Yes. Oppenheimer. They just were upset about it. They have a feeling toward this country and have signed the Espionage Act. They feel this way about it, for I think that the intermediary between Elton and the project thought it was the wrong idea, but said that this was the situation. I don't think they supported it. In fact, I know it. Pash. He made about at least 3 contacts that we know of. Okay, end of recording. Mr. Robb is now speaking. Mr. Garrison. I got, quote, have a feeling, Espionage Act, intermediary between Elton and the project thought it was the wrong idea, was the situation, and there are some words in between there that are indistinct. Is that the way you heard it, Mr. Garrison? More or less. Oh, wait. There we go. I forgot. When I'm reading the transcript of the transcript from 1945, just say the names, but I don't need to say the names for the 1954 transcript because we have the pictures of the people. Anyway, Mr. Garrison, more or less. I'm frank to say I would not feel confident. I did hear intermediary. I heard that. Project and wrong idea. Quote, I don't think he supported it. In fact, I know it, end quote. I heard that. Yes. Perhaps it is not too important. Now, on the next page, the third and fourth paragraphs, quote, this third man, that is right. I'm not quite sure of that. Shall we have it again? Yes. Back to the recording. Pash. He made about at least 3 contacts that we know of. Oppenheimer. I think that's right, yes. Pash. And 2 of these contacts are down there. That means we can assume at least there is one of these men contacted still on the project. Oppenheimer. Yes, I believe that this man has gone or is scheduled to go to Site X. Pash. This third man? Oppenheimer. I think so. End of recording. All right, Mr. Garrison. I heard the words, quote, "this third man," end quote. I heard some indistinct words at the end of the preceding sentence. Quote, "that is right," end quote, I didn't hear. That is unquestionably there. Will you play it again? Back to the recording. Pash, "this third man?" Oppenheimer, "I think so." End of recording. That's right. I heard something like picture. I think that is the picture. Something like that. It could be. Why don't we pass it? One thing, Mr. Chairman. I noticed on the other page. Could I have it once again? Back to the recording. Yes, I believe that this man has gone, or is scheduled to go to Site X. Pash, "this third man?" Oppenheimer, "I think so." I thought he said, quote, "I think so." It sounded this time more like, quote, "I think so. I really just don't know." It would appear, would it not, whether Dr. Oppenheimer said, quote, "that is right," or, quote, "that is the picture," or, quote, "I think so," that he was not indicating disagreement with Colonel Pash at that point. I would take that to be so. Mr. Chairman, I did notice one thing in the record. It mentions on page 7 of the transcript, on the fourth line from the top, as I heard it, it reads, quote, "what I am driving at is that means that there was a plan," end quote. I thought it was is. It doesn't matter at all. Did you get that, Mr. Garrison? No. You don't want to hear that again? No. You won't agree on that? I don't think it is important enough to play again. I don't either. All right. Are we ready to proceed with the next portion? Back to the recording. I would not think that this was a very highly organized or very well put together plan, but I don't know, and I was very much afraid when I heard of Lomanitz's indiscretion that it might very well be serious. I hope that isn't the case. Pash, you mentioned that this man may be a member of the FAECT. Do you think, as a representative of the organization, he would sort of represent their attitude, or do you think he is doing that individually? Oppenheimer. Oh, the FAECT is quite a big union and has all sorts of people in it. I am pretty sure, and I don't think it is conceivable, that he could be representing the attitude of the union. Pash. Well, I don't know enough about it to. Oppenheimer. I think that, well, I don't know. I think at one time they had a strong branch up at the Shell Development Research Laboratories, the FAECT, and I believe it is the union which has got organized on the Hill. Johnson. Yes, it has been around for some time. Pash. This man Elton is a scientist? Oppenheimer. I don't know. I would guess he is some sort of chemical engineer. Pash. Would he be in a position to understand the information furnished him? Oppenheimer. I don't know that either. It would depend on how well it was furnished. I mean, he has some scientific training, and certainly if you sat down with him and took a little time. My view about this whole damn thing, of course, is that the information we are working on is probably known to all the governments that care to find out. The information about what we are doing is probably of no use because it is so damn complicated. I don't I don't agree that the security problem on this project is a bitter one, because if one means by the security problem preventing information of technical use to another country from escaping, but I do think that the intensity of our effort and our concern of the international investment involved, that is information which might alter the course of the other governments, and I don't think it would have any effect on Russia. Then, inaudible, then it might have a very big effect on Germany, and I'm convinced about that, and that is as everyone else is. Pash. Oh. Oppenheimer. To give it roughly what we're after, and I think they don't need to know the technical details because if they were going to do it, they would do it in a different way. They wouldn't take our methods. They couldn't because of certain geographical differences. So I think the kind of thing that would do the greatest damage if it got out would just be the magnitude of the problem and of the time schedules which we think we have of that kind. Pash. To answer your question, Elton, if you were picking a man which would be an intermediary, he wouldn't be a bad choice. I would mention he had some kind of chemical engineering job in Russia. He was trained in England, also in Russia 4 or 5 years, and things like that. Does he speak Russian, do you know? Oppenheimer. I don't know. I don't know. He speaks with a slight English accent. Pash. It is necessary. If it is necessary, would you mind and would it interfere with your work if I would have end of recording? Mr. Chairman, I know the paragraph marked P in this transcript on page 9, about a third of the way down, is actually Dr. Oppenheimer speaking, quote, to answer your question, end quote, and so on. Colonel Pash made some interruption, and then Dr. Oppenheimer continued. Did you get that? No, I didn't. Page 9, quote, to answer your question, Elton, if you were picking a man which would be an intermediary, he wouldn't be a bad choice, end quote. That is obviously Dr. Oppenheimer. Dr. Oppenheimer's voice does come in there. That is Dr. Oppenheimer speaking there, and not Colonel Pash. I'm not sure the words, quote, to answer your question. Could we play that? Before we play it back, let me make a couple of other observations. In the first paragraph on this page, the fifth line from the end of the paragraph, quote, and our concern of the national investment involved, end quote, rather than the international investment. Mr. Robb. Oh, wait. Yes, sir. Our concern with, I think it was also. Yes. And some words after the word escaping that were indistinct and before the word but. I think so. And the dots after the word Russia contained some words. Would you play that portion again? The last third. Before we do that, perhaps we could make one or two observations so that we can be listening to it. Yes. In the next Oppenheimer paragraph, there are some indistinct words to begin with, and, quote, to give it roughly, end quote, I thought it read, quote, to give the Russians, end quote, or, quote, to give Russia, end quote. It could be. And I think they don't. That seemed to me fuzzy. Let us listen to that again. Recording. It might have a very big effect on Germany, and I am convinced about that, and that is as everyone else is. And I think they don't need to know the technical details, because if they were going to do it, they would do it in a different way. They wouldn't take our methods, inaudible. So I think the kind of thing that would do the greatest damage if it got out would just be the magnitude of the problem and of the time schedules which we think we have, that kind of thing. To answer your question, Elton, Pash, Oppenheimer. To answer your question, Elton, if you were picking a man to be an intermediary, would not be a bad choice. He had some kind of chemical engineering job in Russia. He was trained in England. He was in Russia for 4 or 5 years. Inaudible. Pash. Does he speak Russian, do you know? Oppenheimer. I don't know. Inaudible. With a slight English accent. End of recording. Mr. Garrison, did you catch that now? That the P paragraph should be really Dr. Oppenheimer? Yes. And that is, quote, roughly, and not, quote, Russia. I think it is. I think in that paragraph, the language, quote, he was trained in England, was in Russia 4 or 5 years, end quote, rather than also in Russia. I got it, quote, and in Russia. It does make a little difference to say he was trained in Russia or was in Russia. I heard it the way the chairman did. So did I. Was in Russia. He was trained in England, was in Russia 4 or 5 years. In the preceding paragraph, in the interests of grammar, I think actually what Dr. Oppenheimer said at the end of the paragraph, quote, and of the time schedules which we have, that kind of thing, end quote. This is very unimportant. Quote, which we have, that kind of thing, end quote. Mr. Chairman, I wonder if we might take a 5-minute recess. We have a very serious problem about our witnesses. Dr. Betha is here in town ready to testify. So is Mr. Gordon Dean. Dr. Kennan is here from out of town. Dr. Buckley, you remember we talked about last week, is here. Dr. Fisk is here from New York, and General Osborne is also here. I just at this point don't know what to suggest. Obviously, if we go through this at the rate we are, it will consume most of the rest of the morning, and some of this testimony will be quite of considerable length, and I think quite important to the board. I know it would be informative to the board. I would like to ask the board members a question about a ruling that you may recall I made earlier about the necessity for us to hear with counsel the remainder of this transcript. My reaction was that, as I stated, if there were to be any changes, we should hear the discussion, but it does occur to me after having thought about it, if counsel agree, there is no problem. In the event there is a disagreement and it seems to be a material matter, then perhaps we should hear those portions about which there is a disagreement. I would want to make sure that the board would agree with that different kind of ruling on that question. Yes. Is that all right, Dr. Evans? I was certainly in accord with you that we ought to go over this thing together, but if it is necessary, I shall agree to do it the other way. I'm sure that counsel will be diligent. To the extent that counsel can agree, I think it would appear to be pretty clear, and if you cannot, perhaps we shall have to hear the disputed portions. Is that satisfactory to you? Yes, sir. I might suggest that in view of the fact that we will be changing our methods of operation, as it were, I think we ought to attempt to get a complete transcript on which we can agree. So it will be all set out at one part of the record because the record will be hard to understand. I think it's important that the record indicate what has taken place. Yes. I think we should agree and stipulate on the changes we should make and bring that back to the board for its own approval and incorporation in the record, and that the whole document in its original form should go in the record. Mr. Chairman, I might say I also think that the Lansdale transcript should also be set up in the record at the same time. I don't think there is any need to read that because counsel has had it and has read it. Mr. Lansdale testified about it on Friday. I would like, when we have time, to read it into the record because there are some comments, Mr. Chairman, that I would like to make about some passages in it as we go along. I think the transcript as a whole gives a rather fresh impression, and rather a different one of the whole interview. There are some things in it that are really quite worth a moment of thought as we go along, not for the purpose of correction, but for the purpose of illustrating what I think took place. Mr. Chairman, I have some questions as to whether counsel should read a transcript and at the same time make an argument about it. It seems to me that the transcript ought to be before the board for such use as the board wants to make of it. I assume that there will be an appropriate time at the close of these proceedings when counsel can make this argument. All right, I withdraw that, Mr. Chairman, but I would like to have it read because I think it's important for the board to hear it. All right, oh wait, sorry. The board has read it, I assume. You want to read it aloud? Yes. If a request is made for that procedure, I think we will follow it so that it will at the appropriate time be read. I do not think we ought to interrupt at this point to read it. No, sir. Let us take a recess in any event. Mr. Chairman, at the end of the recess, I think we would be prepared to have Dr. Betha. All right. Okay, so then there's a brief recess. So that's interesting. That's really going in depth on this one transcript here from the conversation where Oppenheimer, Pash, and Johnson spoke to each other, where Oppenheimer was talking about the Chevalier incident but didn't want to name Chevalier, and so he mentioned Elton because he felt that Elton was actually a bad actor. But yeah, really this like fine-tooth comb, painstaking evaluation of this transcript from a clandestine recording. So obviously there are moments that are inaudible because it's like, just kind of placing a secret recording device in a room and trying to see what was said and transcribe it can be pretty difficult. But obviously it's materially important to the case because, uh, you know, this is derogatory information against Dr. Oppenheimer. And so it matters what precisely was said to determine if Oppenheimer is a security risk. So it makes sense that they're going over it in this painstaking detail, but it's pretty dense. Anyway, I need a drink of water, and I shall resume in a minute. Okay, let's resume. Do you wish to testify under oath? You are not required to do so. Then we have Gordon Dean. I would be happy to, if that is the custom. All the witnesses have. I shall be glad to. Would you stand and raise your right hand? Gordon Dean, do you swear that the testimony you are to give the board shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Whereupon Gordon Dean was called as a witness, and having been first duly sworn, was examined and testified as follows. Let me just for a second interject and pull up the Wikipedia page for Gordon Dean because I forget exactly what his deal was. Looks like there is no Wikipedia page, at least that we know of. So, oh wait, I spelled it wrong. Here, wait. Gordon Dean. Let's see. Yeah, there's a Dean Gordon football player, but yeah, so that's why I don't know much about this guy. I mean, it's kind of hard to do any research on him. Not much is known, so we have this mystery man here. So we'll find out a little bit more about him as he testifies, I suppose. Okay. It is my duty, Mr. Dean, to say to you that in the event that it becomes necessary for you to discuss restricted data in your testimony, you should advise the chairman of the board of any such disclosure. We would appreciate your full cooperation in that respect. A further observation I should like to make to you is that the proceedings and record of this board are regarded by us as strictly confidential between the Commission and its officials and Dr. Oppenheimer and his representatives and associates, and that the Commission will take no initiative in the public release of any information relating to these proceedings. I think on behalf of the board, I express the hope that witnesses may take the same attitude about it. I think perhaps for the record also that it is my duty, Mr. Dean, to remind you of the penalties under the perjury statutes. I should be glad to read a summary of those provisions, but I assume you are thoroughly familiar with them. I'm familiar with them. Mr. Garrison? All right, direct examination. Mr. Dean, you are a member of Lehman Brothers in New York. I am. And you served on the Atomic Energy Commission from May 1949 to June 1943. That is correct. And you were appointed chairman. When was that? August 1950? I think it was the latter part of August. No, the early part of August, or the last part of July. I have forgotten the exact date. It was the summer of 1950. When did you first become acquainted with Dr. Oppenheimer? I had never met Dr. Oppenheimer until I came to the commission. I met him for the first time when I, as a member of the commission, met with the General Advisory Committee, of which he was then the chairman. Could you give the board a general picture of the positive work of the GAC during Dr. Oppenheimer's chairmanship as you saw it? By positive, I mean what the GAC did to build up and strengthen the military position of the country. I assume that some of this may be repetitious. The GAC was established by law. The members were appointed by the president. They selected their own chairman. This was the way in which Dr. Oppenheimer, having once been appointed by the president, was made chairman of that committee. They used to meet about every month and a half to 2 months. I think the minimum requirement was 4 times a year, but they met much more frequently than that. They sometimes have special called meetings so that they would get together on occasions as much as perhaps 3 weeks apart if the occasion justified it. They also worked through subcommittees of the General Advisory Committee. There was one on weapons. The GAC is essentially a committee of senior scientific people. There were a few exceptions. There were from time to time outstanding businessmen on it, but primarily it is a senior scientific advisory group to the commission, and so specified in the law. They have been very active. They were every moment from the time I went on the commission. It was a very important committee and contributed very much in guidance to the commission on very difficult problems that we had, particularly scientific problems. What was the attitude of the committee? Oh, shoot. I forgot to do something. I forgot to bring Jordan Dean onto the witness stand. There we go. Okay, anyway. What was the attitude of the committee under Dr. Oppenheimer's chairmanship with respect to the expansion of our atomic facilities? In every case, and I might say this to give you just a little bit of history, the Atomic Energy Commission underwent a series of expansions of its facilities. By expansions, I mean this: the design, the construction, and the putting into operation of large reactors, such as those out at Hanford, to produce plutonium on tritium, or other products. The expansion of the large gaseous diffusion plants, which gives you your uranium-235. In other words, when you are talking about facilities, you are talking about facilities which give you the 2 component parts of a weapon, the plutonium and U-235 fissionable material. All of these expansions were blessed by the GAC. I know of no instance where there was an expansion program beginning with the summer of 1949 when we went into the building of a new gaseous diffusion plant at Oak Ridge up until the latest expansion of 1953, which was a $3 billion expansion program. I know of no instance when the expansion program was not thoroughly backed by the GAC and heartily backed. Did they help to suggest and initiate expansion programs? This I would almost have to go back and refer to the minutes of meetings to tell you where an expansion program initiates. It is very hard to put your finger on it. A need arises, and there are many hurdles. Probably the records would show that some had originated with the GAC, but on this I'm not sure. We certainly consulted with them each time when we were thinking of an expansion program. They always blessed it. You spoke of the weapons subcommittee. Was Dr. Oppenheimer a member of that? I think he was a member of the weapons subcommittee the entire time I was on the commission. He was certainly very active in it. It was the most active committee of the GAC. I should say this so far as the GAC and weapons are concerned. I would think that at least 50% and perhaps much more of its time was spent in the weapons field. There was far more interest on the part of the GAC on the weapons program at Los Alamos and the production of fissionable materials than in any other phase. Do you recall a conversation with Dr. Oppenheimer in the spring of 1950 about a bucket of neutrons? I do. Can you say something about the significance of that and of Dr. Oppenheimer's view about what ought to be done? The reference to neutrons was really a suggestion. He spoke of it in the slang term, a bucket of neutrons. What he really meant was that the Commission needed more than anything else were some reactors in which neutrons could be put to their best use. This was, in a sense, the idea behind the Savannah River design and the Savannah River reactors, which were dual purpose. I'm not sure whether this is classified or not. Let us end it there. That was the reason behind the Savannah River reactors. It was in the spring of 1950 that we were considering an expansion program which could carry us either into a strong A program or a strong H program, depending on what our research and development program showed. Did you say the spring of 1950? The spring of 1950. That is when we were getting together and wrapping up the kind of expansion program in order to take care of a stronger A and H program. This is when we first began to think of how we could build the Savannah River reactors. It was an entirely new design. That was put through Congress, as I recall, in the matter of about 90 days in the late spring and early summer of 1950. This is before you became a member of the commission. It began to be discussed while I was a member, and then I had to present the program to Congress in either the late summer, it could have been early fall, of 1950. You became a member of the commission in May 1949? Yes, in May 1949. I beg your pardon? I had the years confused. You were on the commission when all of this developed? Yes. I am not testifying to anything I did not see or experience myself. Dr. Oppenheimer was helpful in connection with this strengthening of the program you have devised. Always. There was one big problem that we had, and that was precisely what kind of design for the Savannah River reactors, and whether you optimize them to produce plutonium or whether you optimize them for the production of other things that looked likely in the thermonuclear program. That went back and forth many times, but it was a question simply of the economics of buying neutrons, so to speak. There was a meeting in June 1951 at Princeton in connection with the H-bomb program. There was. If I could give you a little history before we get to that June meeting, I would like to go back to the fall of 1949. I think it's necessary to have in the back of your mind before you talk about this June meeting in Princeton. In the fall of 1949, the Russians, we learned, this was September, had exploded their first A-bomb. Dr. Oppenheimer, along with 2 or 3 other persons, were brought in here under the auspices, rather joint, of the Atomic Energy Commission and the Air Force to analyze the Russian explosion. This they did and came up with the conclusion that there was no question but that the Russians had exploded an A bomb. Then the question became one of having lost our monopoly if we ever had it. What so we do to intensify the atomic energy program of this country? Let's see, I think what should we do to intensify the atomic energy program of this country? Many things were suggested, including bringing in certain corporations with certain know-hows, such as the DuPont Company, which was done, and they did eventually build the Savannah River reactors. Work on the thermonuclear weapon, many other things, I can't list them all. They can be found in a classified statement which I made before the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy in a closed session. If you have occasion to refer to that, I remember being asked the question, quote, "What do you do now?" And I listed about 8 or 10 things. What was the approximate date of that? This would be in the fall of 1949. This started quite a discussion inside the AEC as to what priority should be given to a thermonuclear program. The only thing that we knew about in this field at that time was one method of approach, which unfortunately, if it is to remain classified, I cannot describe, but I will try to do it in an unclassified language. There was one way of approaching the problem. Nobody had ever built such a gadget. Nobody had ever accumulated enough materials to actually fire a gadget of this kind, as it was then thought of. Nevertheless, there was a feeling on the part of some, including myself, that an effort to go into the thermonuclear or fusion field was something that we could not overlook. Here was a new field. Here was a potential source of great energy. While we didn't know what the gadget might look like when we got through, certainly it should have a high priority in the shop. There were others who felt differently. This was a matter of much discussion. There were discussions at that time between the GAC and the Atomic Energy Commission. Most of the GAC, all of them, decided that we should not go ahead under a high priority in the thermonuclear field at that time. The reasons, as I recall them, were several. There was, I think, in the background on the part of some what I would call a visceral reaction. Pardon me? Visceral reaction of going into a field such as this at this point when these people had developed an A-bomb. They had seen it used successfully. Our A-bombs were getting stronger every year. Our stockpile was growing. Excuse me. I'm trying to describe the events of 1949 and relate them later to the June meeting. I think since we started on this fall of 1949, we better postpone the discussion of the Princeton meeting. I asked you about that only to give the general picture of the work of the GAC. All right. I think it's best we continue now. Since you started on this, I think perhaps it is more appropriate anyway, chronologically, to take it. Are you now beginning to describe the attitudes of the members of the GAC at their October 1949 meeting? I am, as best as I recall them. Then suppose we have it understood that you are now telling the board the general nature of what the GAC reported to the Commission. I would like to go just for a minute into the question of the scope of the report of the GAC to the AEC, and ask you whether, in your opinion, the GAC exceeded its statutory functions, or just how you looked upon the role of the GAC as an advisor to the Commission. The GAC used to be concerned sometimes that it was perhaps exceeding its strict statutory functions. This was never too important to me. I always felt that if we could get the wisdom of the people who were on the GAC, we should have it. So what their statutory function as a committee was not important to me. In this instance, in the fall of 1949, it was not a question of anybody exceeding authority. The then chairman of the commission, Mr. Lilienthal, had asked the General Advisory Committee very specifically to review this question of whether we should attach a high priority to a thermonuclear or a fusion program. They were asked this question. they were asked to consider at their meeting, which took place in October 1949. They did consider it. I think they considered little else. I think for about 3 days than this issue. They came in with their report to the effect that they felt it was a mistake. The reasons that they gave, I suppose, appear in the minutes of the General Advisory Committee, but we had many discussions, and those don't appear in the minutes. The reasons were many. I said there was one, a visceral reaction at first. If I am not departing from the role of witness, I would like to give you my understanding of that reaction. These were men who had developed the A-bomb. Oppenheimer had the big hand in it, as you know. He also had a hand in the measures for the international control of atomic energy, and served on the board, and was a co-author. By the board, you mean the Lilienthal panel. The Lilienthal panel, which later substantially was turned into the Baruch Plan in the UN. They were hopeful at that time that you would not have the world in the position where you had two great powers simply stockpiling weapons and no solution to the problem. Consequently, after 2 or 3 years of rather frustrating dealings with the Russians, when this proposal of building another bigger one hit them, as some said, as the answer to our national security, I think it rather floored them and disgusted them. They lived through the A-bomb. They tried to get international control. If this was the only answer to the problem, namely of building bigger H-bombs, this was not a satisfactory answer for those people. I think it was a stomach reaction along those lines. I did not agree with it, but I think I can understand it. You are referring to those members of the GAC who were atomic scientists. That's right. And specifically, I would say to Oppenheimer and also to Fermi and others who sat on the board, and Conant, because they had all been in the program. There were other reasons, however, beyond the gut reactions for opposing it at that time. You don't decide to manufacture something that has never been invented. Nothing had been invented. No one had any idea what the cost of this thing would be in terms of plutonium bombs. As the debate or discussions waged in the fall of 1949, we had so little information that it was very difficult to know whether this was the wise thing to do, to go after a bomb that might cost us anywhere from 20 plutonium bombs up to 80 plutonium bombs, and then after 2 or 3 years of effort, find that it didn't work. That was the kind of problem. So there were some economics in this thing. There was another reason. This was how much of a diversion of Los Alamos, energies, scientific energies, could you safely divert to a project which might or might not succeed when the ball was rolling so beautifully in your A-bomb program. And we were getting more bang out of our fissionable material, more weapons for the same amount of fissionable material. Those were all considerations. There may have been others in there that I have overlooked, but those are the principal ones. The unknown quantity was very much there. You don't build bombs by memoranda. We could write and discuss and interchange papers all night long, and we were still in the dark on this thing. Mr. Strauss and I at that time felt quite strongly we nevertheless should embark on this. This is after the GAC report. This is after the GAC report. The GAC had another meeting shortly after the October meeting. I think they came together in a matter of 3 or 4 weeks, and as I recall, they reiterated their stand of the October meeting. The commission realized, if I can turn from that now for the chronology, this was a decision which could not be, and should not be, made alone by the Atomic Energy Commission. It was something that had to be resolved eventually by the President. He should make it only after consulting with the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State. So instead of taking a vote as such as I recall was never taken on this issue, we did get together and try to write a paper for the President's guidance. We, as the Commission, in that we attempted to find as many things as we could agree on, premises that we believed to be true, and we wrote those down first. Then we wrote down what might be called a majority report and a minority report. Then we all added individual opinions, so the president could have everything before him. The paper was given to the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense. They had a meeting, and the commission was ordered to go on a high priority thermonuclear research development, and this was done. Once the president made the decision, I know of no instance where it could be said that the members of the GAC or any individual opposed that program. I know of many instances where they helped it, and at great pains. This leads me, I think, into the June meeting. Perhaps just before we get there was a problem of recruitment of physicists. There was a problem. After the president's go-ahead order, after the president's go-ahead order, was the GAC, specifically Dr. Oppenheimer, helpful in that respect? The story did come to me once through Dr. Teller that he was fearful that he would not get much help out of Dr. Oppenheimer in this recruitment program. I said to Dr. Teller, quote, I think what you should do is go up and see Dr. Oppenheimer and see if he cannot give you some help, end quote. So he did. He went to Princeton. My recollection is, I can't give you the exact date on this, I do recall his going to Princeton, and I do recall Dr. Oppenheimer giving him a list of some 10 or 12 names, at least, of people he thought would be helpful in this program. Dr. Teller later advised me that these people were all either at Princeton or the Advanced Institute, and that he was not able to get any of them to leave. That is the story on recruitment. I did several times in appearing before the General Advisory Committee in the summer of 1950 and the spring of 1951, the winter of 1950, ask them for names of people that we could get into the program from universities, from private industry, and so forth, and some names were given to me. Some were successful in getting. Some we were successful in getting. Others we were not. I know of no instance, however, where anyone was discouraged from working on the program by Dr. Oppenheimer. During the spring and summer of 1950, some rather striking developments came along in the A-bomb program. Remember, our stockpile at that time was not as big as we would like to have it. These developments were very big. I think the GAC went out to Los Alamos in the summer of 1950, the Weapons Committee, and we worked with Dr. Bacher, who was then on leave from Caltech and spending some time as a consultant at Los Alamos. Out of this summer's work, and it is hard to credit it to any one person, came some very significant developments which, as I say, almost made it possible to double our stockpile of A-bombs. This was happening at the same time that the H program looked very discouraging. Some studies had been made by Dr. Ulam at Los Alamos, and he ran some samplings which made it look as though an H-bomb built along the lines that were talked about in the fall of 1949 just could not be done, or if done, it would be at such a great cost in A-bombs that you couldn't pay the price. These things were happening. The H-bomb program looked bad. Every result was discouraging. The A-bomb program was improving. However, in the spring of 1951, we started a series of tests. By that, I mean test explosions. We opened in a jury-rig fashion on the Nevada Proving Ground. As I recall, in that year we shot something like 14, 15, maybe 16 bombs altogether. 4 at Eniwetok in the spring of 1951, and quite a few in Nevada. Some of these bore some relationship to a possible H-bomb program, and notably one shot which was fired in May of 1951 at Eniwetok, which I can't describe without using classified information. After that explosion, I thought it was high time that we got together all the people who had any kind of a view on H-weapons. Of course, there were many views among the scientists. By views, I don't mean views as to whether you could have one, but views of whether you could have one and how you would get it. I talked, as I recall, to 2 or 3 of the commissioners and said, wouldn't it be good if we could get them all around a table and make them all face each other, and get the blackboard out and agree on some priorities? We did do that. We asked Dr. Oppenheimer, as chairman of the Weapons Committee of the GAC, to preside at the meeting. We had at that meeting in Princeton in June of 1951 every person, I think, that could conceivably have made a contribution. People like Norris Bradbury, head of the Los Alamos Laboratory, and one or two of his assistants, Dr. Nordheim, I believe, was there from Los Alamos, very active in the H-bomb program. Johnny von Neumann from Princeton, one of the best weapons men in the world, Dr. Teller, Dr. Betha, Dr. Fermi, Johnny Wheeler, all the top men from every laboratory sat around this table, and we went at it for 2 days. Out of the meeting came something which Edward Teller brought into the meeting with his own head, which was an entirely new way of approaching the thermonuclear weapon. It was so different from the things that had been kicked around back in the fall of 1949 that there was no resemblance. I would like to be able to describe that, but it is one of the most sensitive things we have left in the atomic energy program, this method. It was just a theory at this point. Pictures were drawn on the board, calculations were made. Dr. Betha, Dr. Teller, Dr. Fermi participating the most in this. Oppie very active as well. At the end of these 2 days, we were all convinced, everyone in the room, that at last we had something for the first time that looked feasible in the way of an idea. The old idea of the weapon was pretty well discarded. It got about a fourth priority. 2 gadgets were decided upon to try. One had great promise. We didn't know whether it was going to work or not, but it had great promise. I remember leaving that meeting impressed with this fact, that everyone around that table, without exception, and this included Dr. Oppenheimer, was enthusiastic now that you had something foreseeable. I remember going out and in 4 days making a commitment for a new plant to develop an entirely new material. We had no money in the budget to do it with, and getting this thing started on the tracks, there was enthusiasm right through the program for the first time. The bickering was gone. The discussions were pretty well ended, and we were able, within a matter of just about 1 year, to have that gadget ready. It had to be shipped to any Weddock. We had to lay it on the task force, and it was fired in November 1952. Since then, there have been many others fired out in the Pacific in this field. That is the significance of the June meeting. It was the first time that all competent people in this program that could contribute anything sat around the table and finally came up with something they all agreed on. That is when it began to roll, and it rolled very fast then. That is the chronology of it. Dr. Oppenheimer was the chairman of the meeting and presided. He presided at the meeting and participated actively in the meeting and left the meeting enthusiastic. I recall talking with him afterwards, and he was, I could say, almost thrilled that we had something here that looked as though it might work. It has since been demonstrated, I might say, that the gadget which we originally thought of in 1949 probably never would work and would have cost in terms of A-bombs a price we could never have paid. You remember the Crouch incident with which the board here is familiar. The first recollection I have of that, I guess the only one, I'm not asking you to recite what it was because the board knows all about it. Yes, I remember the Crouch incident, if you mean by that his testimony in California. Yes, yes. After that was brought to the attention of the commission, did the chairman ask you to go through Dr. Oppenheimer's personnel file and inquire into the whole question of his clearance? I wonder if you could refresh my recollection on the date. Was this about the summer of 1950? It was in May of 1950, in the spring of 1950. As I recall it, it was before I became chairman. I may have been acting chairman that day in the absence of the chairman. The Crouch incident was brought to my attention. I thought it was something that we ought to talk to Dr. Oppenheimer about. I asked our general counsel, Mr. Volpe, to talk to Dr. Oppenheimer about this Crouch incident. I wanted it delicately done in the first place. I had no idea whether Crouch was telling the truth or not. He did, and reported back to me that he had gone into this at great length with Dr. Oppenheimer, and that no such meeting as Crouch had described, which was, as I recall, a kind of a meeting of a communist cell, to recite the party line, that was supposed to have taken place somewhere in Berkeley back in 1940 or so, no such meeting had ever taken place. He said, quote, "I won't say that I didn't meet Crouch at some cocktail party or something like that, because we had plenty of people around the place, but no such meeting as this, you can be sure." End quote. And then another paragraph of quoting, "I never sat in on any communist meeting or communist cell meeting. This picture, as I recall, is a small group of 4 or 5 people had gone off in a room in a house and talked over the Communist Party line." End quote. Did you go through Dr. Oppenheimer's personnel file? I did. This is the first occasion I ever had to look at Dr. Oppenheimer's personnel file. Ordinarily, commissioners don't go through the files of people unless there is some real reason. Here, however, was a person who was chairman of the committee. He had been cleared in 1947 by the commission, and I, for the first time, picked it up and went through it personally myself. I then asked Dr. Oppenheimer if he could come in and see me about this, and I personally asked him about the Crouch incident. He said substantially what I have said he said in reply to Mr. Volpe, and I believed him. Did you continue to read matters that went into his personnel file after this? I told the security officer, I believe, or perhaps my secretary, that anything coming from the FBI concerning Dr. Oppenheimer I wanted to see, and file in my own mind at least. 2 or 3 did come in, because here was a file with a lot of early association evidence. I thought he was too important a man for me to overlook him, and it was my responsibility as chairman also. So I did see, I am sure, every memorandum from the FBI. But there were only 2 or 3, and there was nothing particularly new in them, as I recall from that point on. What was your belief as to Dr. Oppenheimer's loyalty after you had been through the file and talked with him? There was no question in my mind. I must say, when I first looked at the file, I had doubts, largely growing out of these early associations. But there was never any doubt in my mind after I examined the file, and based partly on my knowledge of Dr. Oppenheimer, which was very close. There was never any doubt as to his loyalty, in my opinion. None. That decision had to be made one way or the other. It could not be halfway. There were some very unpleasant early associations when you look at them in retrospect, but as far as his loyalty, I was convinced of it. Not that the file convinced me so much, but the fact that here was a man, one of the few men who can demonstrate his loyalty to his country by his performance. Most people illustrate their loyalty in negative terms. They did not see somebody. Here is a man who had an unusual record of performance. It is much broader than I have indicated so far. Would you state to the board your general impression of his character, as well as his loyalty, his integrity, and sense of discretion? How would you rate those qualities? I would say that he is a very human man, a sensitive man, a very well-educated man, a man of complete integrity in my association with him, and a very devoted man to his country, and certainly to the Commission. No question of these things in my mind. Would you say a word about Dr. Oppenheimer's interest in military defense in late 1952 and early 1953 in connection with Operation Lincoln, for example? I don't want you to go into great detail. I will just say a word about that because I was not particularly identified with Project Lincoln. Dr. Oppenheimer had many advisory posts to the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and advisor, if not a member, of the Committee on Atomic Energy of the Research and Development Board, and others, and participated in many studies. When he left, when his term had expired as chairman of the GAC in the summer of 1952, he particularly turned his attention to defense measures against A-bombs and spent a very large share of his time on such questions, as the necessity for an adequate radar net, early warning radar system, on certain civilian defense measures, and on the importance of interception, and as always, the importance of our capacity to deliver our bombs. From the very beginning, I recall this is one of Dr. Oppenheimer's great worries, that our Air Force would not stay up at the level of our bomb production, that someday we might find ourselves short of delivery. So he was concerned with all four of these things. You have sat on the Security Council since President Eisenhower's election. Several times on special things. Would you repeat that? I asked him if he had sat on the Security Council under the present administration. The National Security Council. Yes. The chairman is not a member of it, but as questions came up touching on atomic energy, the chairman of the AEC, which I was at the time, was invited over to participate. I guess there were 4 or 5 occasions, perhaps more, in the spring of last year when I did sit on the National Security Council on atomic matters. Did Dr. Bush and Dr. Oppenheimer come before the council when you were sitting on it? They appeared one day, yes. They made a presentation, the nature of which I am sorry I'm a little hazy on. I think it had mostly to do with what at that time was perhaps loosely called Operation Candor, and with civilian defense and other devices. In all of your contacts with Dr. Oppenheimer, has he ever underestimated the Russian threat in your opinion? Never. From the very earliest times, Oppenheimer has been worried very much about, first of all, the lack of reliability of the Russians. He showed some frustration in our inability in the early days to work out a system, and he never underestimated the Russians. A lot of our people have, but this is one man who never did. Do you remember a discussion with Dr. Oppenheimer in the fall of 1950 about his chairmanship of the GAC? Yes, this was after I was chairman. Dr. Oppenheimer came to me one day. His term had to run until August of 1952, I think. As a member? As a member. He was then chairman. He said he knew that we had had quite a disagreement on the H-bomb program back in 1949 and whether it should have been a high priority. He told me that he thought that this had perhaps hurt his effectiveness on the GAC, and that he was prepared to get off if, for one moment, I thought that his effectiveness had been so hurt that he could not serve. I thought about it for a few moments. In fact, I had thought about it before, and I told him that I thought that the GAC would definitely lose, and so would the Commission if we lost him from it at that time, and that I felt, as one who had disagreed with him on the thermonuclear program, that his effectiveness perhaps had been hurt in some quarters and some people's opinions, but not in mine. I would miss him very much if he left. When 1952 came around, he had served his time, and he said, quote, "I have been on too long. I think newer heads should be brought into the program," end quote. And he said, quote, "I hope you would not urge the president to reappoint me," end quote. So I sent a letter to the president saying that these 3 members, Conant, Dubridge, and Oppenheimer, were leaving. I prepared a draft of the letter for the president to sign for each one of them, thanking them for their services, and that was the end of Dr. Oppenheimer's term. Summing up your convictions about Dr. Oppenheimer, you've testified to his loyalty and to his integrity and character with full knowledge of what you told us about your reading of his personnel file. I take it also that it goes without saying that you have read the commissioner's letter which initiated this proceeding. The charges? Yes, I have. The Commission refers to them as items of derogatory information and not as charges. That is right. I read that letter. On the basis of that knowledge and your experience with him, in your opinion, is he or is he not a security risk? He is not a security risk in my opinion. If I had so considered him a security risk, I would have initiated such a hearing long, long ago. I think his usefulness has been impaired by all this. I don't know how much he can contribute further to his country, but I would hope we would get the maximum out of him. I am certain that he is devoted to his country, and if given an opportunity to serve, will serve and effectively, as always. That is all, Mr. Chairman. Okay, so that's the end of the direct examination, and so soon we'll begin the cross examination. I just need another sip of water. But yeah, just from a strategic perspective, that was smart of Garrison to call this witness because this witness disagreed with Oppenheimer on the viability of the thermonuclear program, yet he still vouches for Oppenheimer, which is a very good thing because, you know, one of the accusations against Oppenheimer was that he was being disingenuous when he was sort of speaking pessimistically about the thermonuclear program, like the prospects of it when it was first being discussed and debated. So it's good to have a witness that says, we disagreed, but I don't think he was being disingenuous. I think he was being honest. I think he genuinely had concerns about the program, like working economically and physically. And, when he found out that it would work, he was very happy about that. So that is some good testimony right there. So now we will see what Mr. Robb has in store for the cross examination to respond to this. So let's continue with that. All right, cross examination. Mr. Dean, Dr. Oppenheimer has testified before this board in substance that in 1943 he became aware of an attempt at Russian espionage against the atomic bomb project. He has further testified that when interviewed about this matter by intelligence officers of the U.S. Army, he told these officers a fabrication and tissue of lies. He has also testified, "May I ask, are you quoting from some testimony?" Just a minute, please. Mr. Chairman, I want to object in the strongest terms to the form of the question which counsel has put. I think it is impossible to present to this witness the questions about the Chevalier incident without really thoroughly going into the whole case and incident in all its ramifications. I think the question gives an utterly false summation of what actually happened in the total Chevalier incident, which is the only way that it can be looked at. Mr. Garrison can go into it if he wishes. I think I have the right to put the question to the witness in the form of an assumption, if not otherwise. I take it you are objecting to the question, Mr. Garrison? I am objecting to any question to this witness that tries to put to him the Chevalier incident without going into it in the kind of shape that the matter has come to this board. It involves the whole question of his relations with Chevalier, of his initiating the information about Elterton, of the views of General Groves and Colonel Lansdale. This whole thing has a very long and complicated story. To say here to this witness as a fact that Dr. Oppenheimer did this and that in respect to the Chevalier incident seems to be most unfair. Mr. Chairman, there is not the slightest doubt that Dr. Oppenheimer did testify that he lied to Colonel Pash and Colonel Lansdale, not once but many times, and that his statements, Mr. Chairman, may I finish? And his statements to those officers constituted a fabrication and tissue of lies, and he knew when he was lying. He was impeding the investigation in progress. There is no question in the world that the record shows that. Mr. Chairman, this whole business of the so-called lies over and over again was in fact nothing but one story. He told this story to Colonel Pash. He told part of it that we have reference to here to Colonel Lansdale, By breaking up the component parts of that story into separate questions, counsel, in his cross-examination, made this appear as if one lie after another had been told. It lies heavy on my conscience that I did not at that time object to the impression that was trying to be conveyed to this board of a whole series of lies, when in fact there was one story which was told. Let me ask Mr. Garrison this question. Is it clear that the record shows that there was a fabrication? Yes. I wonder if Mr. Robb can proceed from that point on his question in a way that it would not be objected to. I can't keep Mr. Garrison from objecting, Mr. Chairman. Just so we have no doubt about it, I will read from the record at page 488. Quote, "Isn't it a fair statement today, Dr. Oppenheimer, that according to your testimony now you told not one lie to Colonel Pash, but a whole fabrication and tissue of lies?" Answer, right. Question, in great circumstantial detail, is that correct? Answer, right. End quote. I submit my question on the basis of that is perfectly fair. I don't know what the question is at this point. Of course you don't. Mr. Chairman, it really does not convey at all what this was about. The question of whether Chevalier told 3 men or 1, whether Elton had a contact at the consulate or didn't, whether the consulate had some microfilm or didn't, all that was of an irrelevant character of what the security officer wanted to find out, which was Chevalier's name. The substance of this whole thing is that Dr. Oppenheimer did not for a long time, and he has regretted and has said so explicitly, revealed the name of Chevalier, which was what the security officers wanted. These incidental details about whether there were 3 men or 1 had nothing to do with the problem that the security officers were faced with. I think that is the question that counsel has put to Dr. Oppenheimer in that form I think that is the question that counsel has put to Dr. Oppenheimer in that form was an unfair one, which distorted the record, and I should have objected to it at the time. I would like to say, Mr. Garrison, that frankly the chairman of the board does not know what the question is, and I have heard the witness observe that he does not. I don't know what the question is. The argument to the chairman by the counsel in the presence of the witness pretty well established a background, perhaps, to which you are objecting to in the first place. There has been a discussion of this incident. I should like to ask if Mr. Robb will put his question, and I will give Mr. Garrison an opportunity to object to the question. Mr. Dean, I am going to ask you to assume that Dr. Oppenheimer testified before this board that in 1943 he became aware of an attempt at Russian espionage against the atomic energy project, and assume further that he testified that when interviewed about this matter by intelligence officers of the U.S. Army, he told these officers a fabrication and tissue of lies, and assume further that he testified that when he told these lies, he knew that by telling them he was impeding the investigation of Russian espionage. Now, if Dr. Oppenheimer so testified in substance, would that cause you to change your opinion about him? As a security risk, then, or a security risk today? Now, none. There must have been some reason for... Mr. Chairman, I think the assumptions in his question amount to the same thing as putting to the witness a question as to something which is only a fraction of Dr. Oppenheimer's testimony. One would have to add to that and assume that he initiated the whole matter by bringing to the attention of the security officers that there was a man called Elton who ought to be watched because he had a contact and a way of transmitting information. One would have to assume also that the contact was a colleague at the University of Dr. Oppenheimer's in whom he had complete personal confidence, and ultimately told the name of that friend of his, notwithstanding his belief in his innocence, to General Groves. All of that has also to be assumed because all of that is part of this thing we are talking about. I should like to ask, in view of the answer of the witness, whether it doesn't make any difference now. I'm sorry I answered before you had the opportunity to object. I don't think, as far as this witness is concerned, the additional fact, which then would bring on certain others in fairness in the record, for example, the disclosure of the name was under orders, and things of that sort, but I think all of that, Mr. Garrison, in view of the answer of the witness. Mr. Chairman, I will yield on this point. I didn't actually hear the witness's answer. I would gather the witness's answer was favorable to Dr. Oppenheimer. It was so intended, was it not? Yes, my answer was. Do you mean a security risk then or now? The questioner said, quote, a security risk now, and I said none. I believe you added he must have had a reason for it. Is that right? I don't know all the circumstances. When I say he must have had, I would say I would think there would be some reasons for it, is a better way to put it. I don't know whether we could get into the question for the reason for it without going into the whole record. I frankly don't know the reasons. Would you have thought he was a security risk at that time? Mr. Chairman, that is a highly hypothetical question based on a complete lack of understanding what this is about. How can he possibly testify what his judgment was on an incomplete fragment of the record? I thought the witness had some distinction in his mind. I thought it fair to ask him what it was. The witness indicated a distinction about his testimony, and has said that he would find it difficult to address himself to that question without knowing the circumstances, if I understood his testimony. That is it. Now, Mr. Dean, you spoke of a conversation you had with Dr. Edward Teller concerning Dr. Oppenheimer. Yes, in connection with recruitment? Yes. Yes. Could you fix the date of that conversation? I had difficulty in fixing the date of it. It would be sometime in 1950 or 51. That I am sure. I can't quite place it, though, because Dr. Teller was in and out of Los Alamos so many times during this period, back at the University of Chicago, out to California, back at Los Alamos, that I don't recall the exact times when he was trying to recruit. It may have been in 1951 at a time when he was trying to get support for a second laboratory. It may have been that late. Who was trying, sir? Teller. Would you tell us the substance of that conversation? You mentioned it, but I don't think you told us very much about it. That particular conversation is only one little piece in a long story of the second laboratory, and I had many with Teller. Did you have many with Dr. Teller in which Dr. Oppenheimer was mentioned? I would not say many. His name probably came up in 2 or 3 conversations. Would you give us the substance of those conversations? I wouldn't want to quote on these. I can give you the tenor or the setting for these conversations. That is about all I can do. Teller undoubtedly felt that Oppenheimer was wrong in his original decision on the thermonuclear program in 1949. You mean to oppose it? To have voted against giving it that priority at that time. Teller was an optimist in this field and thought that things could be done. He was very active in recruiting. He told me that he thought he would not get much help out of Oppenheimer. He may even have intimated that Oppenheimer would discourage people from coming. Did he so intimate? Yes, I think that is a fair statement. What did he say about that? He said he feared that he might. I said the way to resolve that is to go up and see him. Did he say why he feared that? No. If he did, I can't recall precisely why. Did you ask him? No, because I knew the 2 personalities so well. 2 men that had little different views on things and how to do things. I was anxious to keep Teller, and I was anxious to get the most out of Oppenheimer. So I said, quote, go up and ask Oppenheimer if he will give you some names, end quote. Oppenheimer, as I recall it, gave him a list of 10 or 12 names. Then Teller came back and reported that they were all people at Princeton, which would be normal to have most of the names at least picked from the place where he was teaching, and that he was unable to get any of them to come. You said at Princeton. You mean they were all working under Dr. Oppenheimer at Princeton? Not necessarily. They were either at Princeton University or the Institute of Advanced Studies. If they were at the Institute, they were under Dr. Oppenheimer. Yes, that's right. And Teller reported that he couldn't get any of them to come. That's right. Did he say what reasons they had given him for not coming? No. Did he attribute their not coming to Dr. Oppenheimer's influence? No, he did not. Sorry. He left an inference that Oppenheimer might have been responsible, but he did not say so in so many words. You gathered that from what Teller stated. Yes, but I also knew the difficulty of getting anybody at that time to go to work with Dr. Teller at a lab which had not been created, and which was completely unplanned, site unselected, the organization for which had not been outlined, and so forth. You mentioned a second lab. Yes. That question came up, I believe, in the fall of 1951, did it not? That is about the time. Subsequent to the Princeton meeting. Yes. I believe you told us at the Princeton meeting everybody agreed that you had the right gadget to make the thermonuclear. Well, we hoped we did. It looked promising. In all events, Dr. Oppenheimer thought so. That's right. Everyone around the table did. In the fall of 1951, Mr. Dean, the GAC recommended against the establishment of a second laboratory, didn't it? I would have to refer to the minutes. I would caution you on this, if I may. When you refer to second lab, I think it is well to define the terms, because the second lab, so-called, had been mentioned to many people. To some, it meant a possible second Los Alamos at a new site in an isolated spot with some 2,000 to 3,000 scientific people in the lab, and equipment which would be necessary, which means a capital investment of $110 million. That is what Los Alamos is. To some people, it meant that kind of a lab. To other people, it meant a very small lab specializing in nuclear fission, low temperature and metallurgy, and to be rather hastily put together, perhaps in Colorado, a place somewhere near Denver and Boulder. To other people, it meant an Air Force lab at Chicago, which would be turned into a thermonuclear lab. This had some support from the Air Force people. To me, and we debated this at some length, it had to be, if it was ever going to work, a place that was already established, if you were going to save time. It had to be a place where you had to have a man in there who commanded respect, that Teller would work for, and work with, and be comfortable working with. There was only one place that I could finally fasten on that fitted this, and this was to work under Ernest Lawrence at an established place. That is, you had a radiation lab. You had another site which we were using for other purposes some 30 miles away at Livermore, and that is eventually what was done. So when people speak of second labs and the controversy concerning second labs, I think it is important that in each case to make them define their terms. They meant entirely different things, some of which, in my opinion, were wise and some of which were not wise. I understand that Mr. Murray, one of the commissioners, and Dr. Teller did present to the GAC a proposal for a second lab in December 1951. Do you recall that? Not specifically, but it is quite possible. In their memorandum, which I believe was prepared by Dr. Teller, it was stated, quote, "The very rapidity of recent progress." Mr. Chairman, may we see this? No, sir. I am asking the chairman if we may have a copy of this document to see what is being read from and what the nature of it is. I will have to inquire as to the security. The document itself is classified. I think the portion he is reading may be read without disclosing security information. I submit that the document be shown to Mr. Dean, who is cleared for security information. Much of this may be obviated if Mr. Garrison would wait until I complete my question before interrupting me. I would suggest that Mr. Robb read his question and see if you feel that there is any difficulty about it, Mr. Garrison. Mr. Chairman, I might say, in general, that I had understood that this was not a court proceeding, and I was going along on that assumption. I think it is clear I have refrained from making the slightest objection to any of Mr. Garrison's questions or testimony or anything. I don't care what form Mr. Garrison puts his questions. I assume this is not a court proceeding. But if Mr. Garrison is going to stick on technicalities and turn this into a proceeding according to the strict rules of evidence, I think we ought to have it understood here and now. Mr. Chairman, it certainly was our understanding that this was to be an inquiry and not a trial. That's correct. I do most earnestly say to the board that the only objections that I have raised with respect to cross-examination, which at times in this room has taken on the atmosphere of a prosecution than anything else, which I have not, though perhaps I should have objected, the only questions I have raised have seemed to me to be of a rather basic character, where a scrap of a document has been read from without either the witness or ourselves knowing what the content was. I think if you will examine the Pash and Lansdale transcripts, as I know you will in full, you'll find that the things taken out of context have been given not really a fair impression. This to me is rather elementary and not a technical matter. With respect to those documents, of course they will be in the record. The chair does not know from what document Mr. Robb is reading or whether it can be made available. I repeat, I suggest that he read the question, and if the witness finds it confusing or alien to him, he can so indicate. Then, if you object to the question being put, I should like to hear from you. All right. Could you tell me again, Mr. Robb, what is the memo purported to be dated to and from? It is a memorandum from Commissioner Murray and Dr. Teller to the GAC. What I'm going to do is ask you if you recall this was the position those two gentlemen took. If you don't, that is the end of it. I'm advised that they stated in their memorandum, quote, "The very rapidity of recent progress is evidence of potentialities which have been neglected for years, and which will not be fully exploited unless a new laboratory is established." End quote. Do you recall any such argument as that being made for a new laboratory? There were many arguments along this line, and it's quite possible that some such thing was said. I'm sure that the matter came before the GAC in one form or another. It is consistent that Tom Murray and Teller should be for a second laboratory of some kind because they both felt very strongly about it, as I did, as a matter of fact. But it was a question of where, when, and who. The second lab which Teller and Murray were for was the second lab to work on the thermonuclear, is that right? This is not clear. Perhaps the document may clear it up as to what kind of lab they were talking about at that point. What is your best recollection about it, sir? As you see, there are two kinds of labs you could have to work on the thermonuclear. One is an across-the-board laboratory such as Los Alamos, with all of its departments, a test division, physics division, a chemistry division, a metallurgical division, and all the other divisions which make an integrated laboratory. This is one way, and perhaps this is the best way to have a thermonuclear laboratory, if you had the time, because so many of the problems that touch on fission bear on fusion. Some of our current gadgets get much of their energy from the fission process, as well as the fusion process. So theoretically, if you had time and money and everything, you would build another Los Alamos. We didn't feel we had that. I don't know whether this particular proposal was that broad or whether it was the kind of proposal that Teller and I talked about several times, which was simply a very specialized laboratory emphasizing low temperature work and some metallurgy. That is why I think you have to define your terms on this. If there is anything in the document which describes what type of lab at that point, then I can do it. But just a second lab with all the labs we had at that time was, in any event, Mr. Dean, did there come a time when the GAC did take a position on the establishment of a second lab for whatever purpose? Yes, I believe they did. I cannot recall at this moment, and I wish my recollection could be refreshed by some document, what the issue was before the GAC at that time. If it was an across the board, another Los Alamos, I am sure they said no to it, because I do recall many discussions saying who would you get to run it? Where would you recruit the men who knew about the weapons? Who were all at Los Alamos at that time? A few people in specialties at some of the universities, such as Ohio State, which had a very strong low temperature group and so forth. But virtually all the people that would contribute to this would be people who were working for us in the weapons lab with a few outsiders. So I'm sure that the GAC at that time, however the issue was presented to them, concluded that just didn't make sense. Do you remember when that was? I don't really. It could have been either the fall of 1951 or all the way through 1952, because it seems to me it was a matter, did there come a time, could we have the date of that memorandum? This memorandum is a compilation of memoranda, but the particular memorandum I was referring to was prepared in December 1951. Mr. Dean, did there come a time when you yourself, as chairman of the AEC, wrote to the Joint Congressional Committee on Atomic Energy respecting the establishment of a second lab? I'm sure there must have been, but I don't have the documents. Do you recall when that might have been? If you will give me some hint as to what I said in it, I could perhaps time it. Frankly, I don't have your entire letter, but I will try to give you a hint. All right. I don't know whether this is classified or not. Is it, Mr. Rolander? I did write a letter on this whole thing on the second lab at one time. Just what must be done about it, and how to do it, and so forth. But it seems to me that was internal. I am told I can read this. Quote, January 9, 1952, end quote. Does that accord with your memory? No, it doesn't, but go ahead. We will get the substance. Quote, the creation of a dual laboratory such as Los Alamos would dilute scientific talent and introduce difficult problems of coordination. Further, because of the disassociation of talent and effort between two laboratories, the rate of progress would be reduced. We further feel that the divisions of talent between Los Alamos and a competing laboratory would at this time retard rather than accelerate the development program. Scientists of the caliber necessary to man and administer another laboratory for the prosecution of the development program similar in scope to Los Alamos are limited in number, end quote. Do you recall something about that? Yes, that would be my view today. That was a fair statement of your position at that time. Yes, if you are talking about another Los Alamos, and I think I kept saying such as Los Alamos all the time. Where had you received your information as to the availability of scientists necessary to man another laboratory? This I had to live with every day. Had you obtained some sort... Had you obtained some of it from Dr. Oppenheimer? I don't recall. We may have had conversations, but you can be sure that I also talked to all of the top scientists about this topic. This would be von Neumann and members of the commission like Smith. It would be Dr. Robbie, who was quite helpful in recruiting a few people for us. It certainly would not be attributed to one man. This was something you had to keep on top of all the time. Do you remember subsequent to that, I think in February 1952, when the GAC again recommended against the establishment of a second lab? I don't recall that specific date, but it would not be inconsistent with what I know, that they took a position against another Los Alamos. Did the GAC ever recommend in favor of a second lab of whatever kind, Los Alamos or anything else? I reported eventually. I can't say this was my solution. Undoubtedly, some of the other commissioners helped with it. My idea was finally, after this had all been worked out, that if you were going to have a place where you could put Teller, and some of the other people to the best use, and if they were not at Los Alamos, the best place was under Dr. Ernest Lawrence, out on the West Coast. I did not quite know what the shape of this laboratory was going to be when it first started out. Excuse me, Mr. Dean. I asked you whether or not the GAC made any recommendation, not what you said. What the GAC did. About the second lab? Yes. If by the second lab you mean the Berkeley, any kind of lab. They certainly did not frown on putting Teller out under Lawrence, and that is what the second lab, as it turned out to be, was. When did that take place? This took place, I would say, about a year after the spring of 1951 shot. I fix that date because the men who went out from Lawrence's lab, I'm sorry, I've forgotten this man's name, Dr. York went out and did some tests in the spring of 1951 on the shot that dealt somewhat with thermonuclear processes. They came back quite an equipped group of able young men. Here was a nucleus, and it happened to be in Lawrence's lab. You could put Teller in there. I recall we put this to the GAC, and everybody felt that it was fine. We had found a place where Teller was happy and could work. I think this was the reaction. About when was that, do you remember? I say I think this must have been a year after the shot in the spring of 1951, which would put it somewhere over perhaps May of 1952. Where was that place that Teller worked? Livermore? That's where he was put to work, yes, sir. Was there an establishment set up there? There had been an establishment there before. That is another attractive thing about it. It had some buildings. We had some barracks. We had a big armory that we could use immediately. We got some instruments in very fast. It recruited very rapidly under Lawrence, York, Teller. Something interesting is that Livermore is this town in California, and currently there's the Lawrence Livermore Laboratories, which back in September of 2023 had a breakthrough in the sort of nuclear fusion energy program. So Lawrence Livermore Labs is still a big nuclear physics lab in the US and still doing some pretty important work. So, yeah. Anyway. Did you expand those facilities substantially? Yes, they were expanded very fast. Did you spend a great deal of money on it? We spent, I think perhaps I could not give you the dollar figure, I imagine something like 11 million. No, I don't dare risk a figure. In other words, it became a very substantial establishment. Yes. I believe you said you had no difficulty in recruiting for it. We were recruiting an entirely different group at this point. We were recruiting men for that laboratory, I would say practically all of who came immediately out of school. They were young PhDs and some not PhDs. We did not get in that laboratory any of the people, as I recall, that we originally thought of as being available for use on a thermonuclear project, like sites. The name slipped me. None of those people went to Berkeley. What they did was under Lawrence's administration, with Teller as the idea man, with York as the man who would pick up the ideas, and a whole raft of young imaginative fellows. You had a laboratory working entirely on thermonuclear work. That lab was devoted entirely to thermonuclear? Yes, but one thing that must not be forgotten is that throughout the whole second lab thing, may I elaborate here on the background? Go ahead, I'm not sticking to the rules of evidence. One of the big problems of setting up a second lab, and what kind of a lab was this, was always this: the morale of Los Alamos. Los Alamos, let us not forget this, is the lab which has been responsible for all of the research in the development of our A-bombs, and all of the research and development until recently on the thermonuclear weapons. They have all come out of Los Alamos. I always feared, and many others feared, that if you made any drastic move which struck at Los Alamos morale, or if you inferred for one moment that they were not working their hearts out, because, believe me, they were proving it with their results, you had a real problem in this weapons development field. That was one of the touchy things about setting up a new lab. Who was going to man it? What kind of lab would it be, and what would it do to Los Alamos? That was the big fear I had. Mr. Dean, when you did set up this laboratory at Livermore, it worked out very well. It didn't impair morale at Los Alamos? No. Los Alamos rolled very fast, as it always has rolled. I think it worked largely because of Teller getting along very well with Dr. Lawrence. These things are a question of human relations. They got along extremely well. In fact, Mr. Dean, wasn't there a healthy spirit of competition between Los Alamos and Livermore after you set up Livermore? I don't know it produced any more weapons, but there probably was a good sense of competition. And you have already said that you had no trouble of getting personnel. Not of the type I desired. These were not the specialists that we wanted to get in the early days for the real rush. Very few of those ever came. Those people never went to California later on. How long would you say that the discussion went on before you finally established that lab at Livermore? How long did this discussion about establishing a second lab, whatever you want to call it, go on? A year? It could have been a year, yes. In the meantime, however, Los Alamos was doing the work, and that is what we are testing today in the Pacific. Is that laboratory at Livermore independent of Los Alamos, or was it? Yes, it is independent, except that you have to have a very close liaison for test schedules and everything else. I understand that. Very close relations, but it is independent of Los Alamos. It should be pointed out that the University of California is the contractor for Los Alamos, and the University of California is also the contractor to the Commission for the Livermore Lab, but only in that sense are they related. Let me interrupt. How much longer do you think you will take? Probably 10 or 15 minutes, maybe more depending on Mr. Dean. Then there's discussion off the record. Mr. Dean, I will say, I think they want to go to lunch, the judges, or the board, the chairman. Mr. Dean, I have in my notes that you testified that all expansions of the atomic program were blessed by the GAC beginning in 1949. You were not thinking about the second lab in that connection, were you? No. When I speak of expansion programs, I am speaking of the erection of facilities with which to make bombs, and that is either plutonium or U-235 for the most part. You mentioned Dr. Oppenheimer's attitude on Project Lincoln. That was the project to discuss the defense of the continental U.S., was it? Yes, I believe that is a fair description. This was not done under the auspices of the Commission, and I was not close to Lincoln. I just read the report when it was finished. That was done under the auspices of the Army? Somewhere in the Department of Defense. Which agency did it, I don't know. Perhaps the Air Force. Did you learn what theory Dr. Oppenheimer espoused in that connection? I would hate to be examined in the Lincoln report. I really don't have a good recollection of it. Do you recall, if you don't, you can say so, of course, do you recall whether or not he espoused what might be described as a Maginot Line type defense? I don't know what Maginot Line means. I mean a fixed defense. For context, Maginot Line is this sort of line of defense along the French-German border that the French set up after World War I in case the Germans invaded again. And when World War II happened, at the very start of not the very start, because first Germany invaded Poland, but when Germany invaded France, they went around the Maginot Line by going through Belgium. And France had neglected to extend that Maginot Line from the German border up to the Belgian border, because they're like, well, Belgium's not going to attack us, right? But Germany was able to conquer Belgium and get through there. But anyway, that's what the Maginot Line is. I mean a fixed defense. No, I mean, does it mean in terms of radar defense? No, a fixed defense as distinguished from a strong offensive striking force. I can't say. You don't recall? I just don't recall. You mentioned Dr. Oppenheimer's connection with the long range detection program. Were you familiar with that? Oh, yes. Was that done under the auspices of the AEC? Strictly speaking, it was AFOAT. May I interpose here, Mr. Dean? I'm reminded that if you get into classified material, would you be good enough to indicate so that we can take the appropriate steps? I won't consciously do it. Sometimes I have a question because these things change from day to day. Why don't we just call it Air Force? This has been gone into on direct examination, and I would like to ask some questions about it. I was not under the impression I had. Yes, didn't you say something about Dr. Oppenheimer's connection with the long-range detection program? In this one instance, I stated he was called back in the fall of 1949 to make an appraisal of the Russian bomb. And you told something about what his appraisal was, didn't you? That they had shot one. I want to ask the same question. I want to ask some questions about that. I'm told that these questions will involve confidential classified material. In that event, we will have to excuse counsel and anyone else who is not cleared for the disclosure of classified material. Is the classification officer clear that this has to be answered only off the record? Then discussion off the record. Then Mr. Robb. And so I think, yeah, okay. Mr. Dean, do you recall that there were 3 methods of long-range detection which were discussed at that time? Then Mr. Beckerly, I don't think I have a slide for him because I've never heard of this guy. Mr. Beckerly says, I don't see how one can get into this without disclosing information presently considered by the DoD as classified. I'm sorry, Mr. Garrison. You will have to be excused, although Dr. Oppenheimer will remain. I assume that this has relevance. I would not ask the question if I did not think so, Mr. Garrison. So then counsel leaves the room, and the following portion of transcript, pages 1014 through 1016, is classified and contained in a separate volume. This has since been declassified, so I will pull that up, and now we have entered dark, murky, classified territory. So, yeah, okay. Are you ready, Doctor? Yes, sir. The question is whether 3 methods were discussed. Yes. I'm not the best witness on this. I only recall 2 basic ways of determining it. Which were they? One would be by cloud analysis and sampling, in which you use radiochemistry to determine the fragments that are there and their half-lives. You can determine roughly the efficiency of the burn-up of the material and things of this character. We had a program on to sample, and in that way it was determined. That was Dr. Oppenheimer's chief role at that time in this field of sampling clouds. Mr. Dean, would that be called the nuclear method? I'm not a good witness on this. Yes, it involves both chemistry and it involves nuclear physics subject to correction at all times. What was the other method that you recall? The other kind of obvious method would be things like measuring the earth shock or sound waves, things of this character, as you do in recording an earthquake. That is the seismic method. Yes. Was there a third method which was referred to as the sonic method? I would think they might try that too. Which method did Dr. Oppenheimer espouse? I don't think he espoused any. I know the one we detected, it was the first method, and that is the one he was concerned with. Do you remember he opposed instituting the seismic and sonic methods in the future? I have no knowledge of this. Do you recall that he suggested that those methods be not adopted without further extensive research? I have no knowledge of this. You have no knowledge of that at all? No, I wouldn't ordinarily, because again, he is sitting as a committee of advisors, you see, reporting to the Air Force, not to the Commission. The Commission had to follow it closely, but it was in that capacity that he acted in 1949 and subsequent occasions when the Russians exploded. Then there's some discussion off the record. I don't believe we can get anything in the record on the basis of his testimony on that. Is there anything else along this line? Nothing further. And that's the end of the classified portion. Which today, a lot of that stuff is, I mean, it's all common knowledge, obviously, as in, like, none of it's classified anymore because they released it, but I've heard of this stuff before, I think in like documentaries and stuff, different ways to detect nuclear bombs going off so that you can enforce disarmament treaties, because how can you enforce a disarmament treaty if you don't know that they're actually disarming, right? So, but anyway, okay. So the council has returned. I think counsel for Dr. Oppenheimer should know that in the judgment of the chairman of the board, I would ask the other board members to listen to this. Nothing transpired of consequence in absence of counsel. Do you agree? I do. I do. The witness said he didn't know much about that subject. That is correct. Mr. Dean, you testified somewhat about conversations you had with Edward Teller about Dr. Oppenheimer, did you not? As to recruitment, I think so. I have the impression that Dr. Teller was inclined to be critical of Dr. Oppenheimer in those conversations. Is that right? The best I can recall is the inference he left from what he said, that he feared that Oppenheimer would not be helpful in recruiting men for him. That is what I thought you said. Didn't you have any conversations with other nuclear physicists who were also critical of Dr. Oppenheimer because of Dr. Oppenheimer's attitude on the thermonuclear? I can recall 3 people, and I would urge you very much to have them in front of you as witnesses, and for the board to call them. One would be Dr. Ken Pitzer. I say 3, and I don't recall them. I would certainly say Teller. Those were about the only 2. Alvarez? I never heard Luis Alvarez speak. Lawrence? No, I don't recall any conversations with Ernest Lawrence about Oppenheimer. There may have been some. You mentioned Dr. Pitzer. What was his conversation about Dr. Oppenheimer, and when did it take place? It was not a conversation, it was some letters and a speech he made in which he voiced criticism of the GAC. I think he may have named Dr. Oppenheimer and Conant by name, but it was clear he meant these 2 gentlemen. What was the substance of that criticism? It was general. I think the speech was given to refer to one document before some teachers in the Long Beach schools shortly after Pitzer left the Atomic Energy Commission. The general criticism, although he was somewhat specific in certain particulars, was that the GAC was not imaginative enough. I remember 2 or 3 things that he criticized. One was that they were very conservative. He may have implied criticism of the commission as well. I have forgotten this. That is, in setting the standards for the reactors, that we required too much isolation. I seem to recall that he advocated a reactor that would blow up so we would find out what would happen, so we would finally know. There were other items in the speech that were critical. I don't recall any of them in the weapons field, however. Critical of whom? GAC. That would include Dr. Oppenheimer. Yes, he undoubtedly meant Dr. Oppenheimer, as I read it. You said that he suggested that the Commission was requiring too much isolation on your reactors. That's right. I remember specifically he mentioned the Wahluke Slope, which is a large area of sagebrush on the other side of the Columbia River from the Hanford Works. He thought we should have completely opened up the Wahluke Slope to irrigation, and therefore farming, and therefore to people. We were far too cautious in having a safe area around reactors. Was his suggestion that by locating reactors so far out in the wilderness you were making it difficult to get personnel? No. Then why did he object to putting reactors out in the wilderness? He thought the day was coming very fast when you ought to be thinking about central station power plants. If you are going to get in that region, you ought to have them down near the middle of town. If we took undue safety measures, we were far too cautious. Did any scientist ever suggest to you that while you were on the commission, that you were putting your laboratories and reactors too far away, way out in the woods, so you couldn't get people? No, not to get people, but that we were just unduly safe and we required too much land. We had some 200,000 acres in Idaho, and the same at Hanford. Mr. Dean, what I was trying to get at, why did it make any difference to a scientist if you had 10 acres, 10,000 acres, or 10 million acres? I think Pitzer at that time was arguing that we were far too cautious in our safety standards, far too cautious. That was the general gist of his criticism. His speech is available. He wrote in some other periodical. I can't place it. Now, Mr. Dean, you testified that you read what you described okay, here, wait. I just want to say briefly about the isolation of reactors. Is that, at least for energy concerns, the problem with isolating a reactor super far out of the way is that transmission lines for power are not perfectly efficient. They have internal resistance. And so the farther away your power station is from the population that needs to use the energy, the less energy actually shows up at the end of the line for that population. And with nuclear power, you obviously have the concern of, safety of residents near the reactor. And so you have to achieve this sort of balancing act where you don't necessarily want a reactor in the middle of a giant city, but you do want it close to the city so that the power can effectively get to the customers in that city. It's an important balancing act, and the more that we learn about nuclear power and the more that we develop ways to make it safer, the more that balance starts to swing towards we should have them closer to more populated areas just to be more economically efficient, and it's not as big of a safety risk as we once thought it was. So, yeah. Anyway. Now, Mr. Dean, you testified that you read what you described the file on Dr. Oppenheimer, the then file. That was the Atomic Energy Commission's clearance file. Yes. It was a collection of all FBI reports and things that came in. How many... Oh, wait, sorry. Yes, it was a collection of all FBI reports and things that came in. How many volumes was it? I don't recall. 1? I have no idea. I have no idea whether it was 1 or 2 or 3. How long did it take you to read it? I have no idea. An hour or 2 hours? I just don't recall. I have no idea. I may have taken it home. I may have forgotten. Did you read any files of the Manhattan Engineering District? Yes. I recognized when I saw this list of derogatory information many things that were in that file. In that file? Yes. Where did you get that file? From our security officers, as I recall. It was in your file? In the shop. You are sure about that? Yes, it was. If I told you that file had been over at the FBI since 1946, would that change your answer? It would not, because that is not the file I read. I read the file if you are imputing to me or suggesting that I did not read a file on Dr. Oppenheimer, including the early derogatory. You are wrong. Of course you had a file. I'm trying to find out which one you read. This I couldn't tell you. You don't know whether you read the Manhattan Engineering District files or not. I can't recall whether it was so labeled. It had material in it dealing with the earlier days. Yes, those were reports. As I recall, FBI reports. Did you see any transcripts of questions and answer interviews with Dr. Oppenheimer? I've seen interviews with the FBI in that file, but those were not question and answers, were they? As I recall, they were summaries of testimony. You said you, I believe, talked to Dr. Oppenheimer about this Crouch matter. Yes. And he told you he had never sat in on any communist meeting. There was a specific meeting that was referred to by Crouch. I know. I have a note here in quotes, I never sat in on any communist meeting, end quote. Did he tell you that? I wouldn't be sure of the exact words. What he did tell me was that he never sat in any meeting such as this that Crouch had talked about. Did you ask him whether he had ever been to any communist meeting? I don't recall. Would that have been a natural question to ask him? It might have been. But you don't recall whether you did or not. I don't. I was dealing entirely with new evidence which came up in the Crouch episode. Yes. That is all I interrogated him on. But you were undertaking to evaluate him as a security risk, weren't you? I had to do that every day. As a part of that evaluation, wasn't it important to you to know if he had not attended the meeting described by Crouch, whether he might have attended the other similar meetings? It was not particularly important to me to know what kind of meetings he attended in 1941. I had known the man 11 years before. As far as you were concerned, he might have attended a dozen Communist Party meetings in 1941. I had no evidence from the file. But you said it was not important to you what meetings he attended in 1941, is that right? It certainly was not important to me at that time because the only question in my mind was, is Crouch telling the truth about a specific meeting? That is what I'm getting at. If he had not attended the Crouch meeting, you were not concerned with how many other similar meetings he attended. That was not the issue before me at the time. Would you answer my question? All right. If he had not attended the Crouch meeting, you were not concerned with how many other communist meetings he might have attended. At that time, no, I was not. Mr. Dean, I will read you the question and answer. I have before me, Mr. Dean, which I received from a reliable source, and having been Washington, there are both kinds, reliable and unreliable. You will know that the testimony at the executive sessions of Congress cannot be released without a vote of the committee and so forth. Yes. I have reason to believe that the following took place at a meeting of the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy on February 21, 1952. I will read you this and ask you if you remember it, and if you have any comment to make on it. Mr. Chairman, I make the same objection to reading from documents that can't be shown and looked at. He says he has reason to believe they represent what took place. I would ask counsel whether he can summarize what he understands to be the situation. I will try it that way. Do you recall, Mr. Dean, that there was a meeting up there in February 1952 at which you testified? I was there about once a week for about 4 years. That's why I wanted to read this to you to see if it rang a bell. Am I supposed to be testifying at this point or someone else? I'm just about to read it. As I understand it, Senator Hickenlooper was talking and you were on the stand, and you stated that, quote, progress had been sudden and remarkable in the last 2 years, end quote. Senator Hickenlooper then said, quote, I might tend to agree with you with your statement that you made some substantial progress. I mean, I may be reckless for not going faster, but the GAC in 1949 was against the hydrogen project. A majority of the commission was against the hydrogen project. If you will read the minutes, which you probably have, you will find it stopped on dead center there and never even got started until late 1949, or perhaps I think the chairman went after them and raised the devil, and the committee expressed its thinking we ought to move on that project. But I do think there was an inertia there for a long period of time. I wish to say the lease has not been picked up except on the last couple of years, end quote. Then, quoting Mr. Dean, this is true, end quote. Do you recall that taking place or anything like that? It might have. It might have been. Mr. Chairman, I think that ending abruptly at this point, I have no idea what else Mr. Dean may have added to that. Is there something that follows that? Or what the next topic of conversation is? Yes, I will read the next. Quote, in the last 2 years. End quote. Senator Hickenlooper then said, quote, I might tend... Oh, wait. The page repeated. Okay, yes, I will read the next. Quote, Hickenlooper. So the whole hydrogen project has suffered from an inertia since 1946. Based upon the limitations of the experiments and the knowledge at that time in 1946, we had 2 or 3 expositions of the feasibility of this hydrogen project and flat statements from reliable people that in their opinion the hydrogen explosion was feasible based upon what they had learned up to that time. They said there were things they had to prove. That is very true, but there was a complete inertia and the GAC was partly responsible for that, and the commission was partly responsible for that, because both of them by majority vote advised against going into the hydrogen problem, end quote. This is all Senator Hickenlooper? Yes, sir. Quote, some of the reasons were put on moral grounds, others were put on the question of feasibility, but there was that inertia, and that has contributed to us being no farther along than we are at the moment, end quote. Mr. Dean, was there inertia? Did Mr. Dean make any comment? No, sir, not that I have here. The full text of the hearing might be enlightening to the board. I don't have it, I'm sorry. I'm sure you can get it from the Joint Committee. The word inertia is perhaps not the best way to describe a very complicated situation. If I can go back into a little history, and I think this does become important because of these popular charges I have seen of delay in the hydrogen bomb. That is why I wanted to get your views. Let me interrupt again. It is now after 1 o'clock. That is my last question. It is entirely up to Mr. Dean how long he talks, unless he suggests something in his answer that makes me ask another question. It depends on what you mean by inertia. It was known in the Los Alamos lab and long before the Los Alamos lab, perhaps 20 years before Los Alamos was created, and maybe much before that one way of getting terrific amounts of energy was through the fusion process. But no one foresaw a way to do it because you could not get the heat to fuse. There is a story I remember running into when I first went to the commission about a scientist going to the mayor of Moscow, I believe, and saying, quote, if you will give me all the electrical energy that lights the city of Moscow in one night, I will somehow concentrate this and bring about a fusion reaction, end quote. It had been written about. I don't know how he was going to do this, but that was the idea. It has been written about in popular form. The principle was well known. But at the end of the war, as you know from history, Los Alamos, just like everything else in our defense effort, slowed down. The boys came home and literally the scientists went home. It was at a low state of morale. We were working on an A-bomb. There was no incentive particularly at this time to develop an H-bomb. The incentive came, it seemed to me, for the first time, although some theoretical work was being done. You just don't make an H-bomb. You go out and measure the cross-sections of various elements and combinations of elements. There is a lot of fundamental work that goes on before you even think of developing a gadget. The incentive came in 1949 to develop the H-bomb. This came almost entirely from the A-bomb explosion by the Russians. What do you mean by inertia at Los Alamos? The A-bomb program was going. Should you divert your people to an H-bomb program at that point? Nobody else did anywhere in our defense establishment. We cut down our Navy, we put it in mothballs, and all these things happened because the war was over. You don't get incentives out of a peacetime situation such as you had at the close of the war. The Russians gave us an incentive to work on something, and we went to it. The delays or inertia are not realistic. They are not good words to describe what transpired. We never saw anything that really had a chance until the Princeton meeting in June of 1951. We never had a chance. You will always get some scientist to say, quote, "I think I know a way to do," end quote, and you'll always give him a chance to draw it out and spell it out and interrogate him. But all the competent people in our program, even those enthusiastic for H-bomb program, say, in the spring of 1950, were pretty blue people because it didn't look like you could do it unless you came up with a new idea. The new idea came up in the Princeton meeting in June of 1950. I don't know what words you apply to situations like that are complicated. Inertia probably is not a good word. There was not incentive to do it. There was every incentive to make your A stockpile strong. One further question is suggested, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dean, do you know anything about an order in December 1952 to move Dr. Oppenheimer's papers back to Washington? December 1952? Yes, it was done on my orders. Why was that? Because his job had terminated as chairman of the GAC. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to have to put a pause there because they go on for a while. And I am running out of time on this room. So, yeah. So let me pause there. But I will resume at a later date next week. Okay. So yeah, so that's some interesting stuff. Testimony from Gordon Dean. Sorry to cut it off at an awkward moment, just in the middle of his testimony. But you know, I'm running out of time. So yeah, so that was pretty interesting stuff. Dean is definitely, trying to help the defense here. We have some contentious moments between the defense and the prosecution about, procedure and things like that, and Mr. Robb offering this sort of kind of like deadpan sarcasm in response to Garrison's objections, because he's like, it's kind of like playing dumb. It's like, what? I'm not doing anything. What do you think I'm doing? I'm not doing anything. I don't know. Like, trying to look inconspicuous. But yeah, once again, it's just this debate over like whenever something classified comes up, the defense counsel has to leave the room because they can't know classified things. They can't be like they can't have it divulged to them, which is a pretty big problem. Which isn't something that would stand up in court. You can't just have your defense team forced to leave the room or not be furnished with certain documents because they're classified. It's it's not like that doesn't accord with court procedure, but since this is an informal court procedure and isn't a full court procedure, they're kind of allowed to do it. So yeah, but anyway, interesting stuff, and I'll resume next week. So I hope you all have a great week. Bye-bye.